marvelous long reads.
Welcome, my legion of the undead. Tonight, Longreads digs its fangs into the Tomb of Dracula, the complete original 1970s run that drenched Marvel Comics in blood and shadow. Witness the rise of the Lord of the Vampires himself as he claws through centuries, carving a crimson legacy of terror across the living and the damned. From fog-soaked graveyards to blood-soaked vengeance, every page screams with gothic horror and unholy beauty. This is no fairy tale, this is the hunt, the hunger, and the horror reborn. When the night bleeds, only Dracula feeds. Chapter 1. Dracula. Frank Drake, descendant of Count Dracula, traveled to Transylvania with his girlfriend Jeannie and his friend Clifton Grave after inheriting the infamous Castle Dracula. Their car broke down en route, and upon reaching a nearby village, they found locals steeped in superstition. Ignoring their warnings, Frank, determined to turn the castle into a tourist attraction, hired Otto to take them the rest of the way. Clifton's behavior grew increasingly erratic and his jealousy toward Frank and Jeannie deepened. At the castle, memories of Frank's squandered inheritance and failed ambitions haunted him. Inside, the trio was attacked by bats, prompting them to split up. Clifton, exploring alone, fell through rotten floorboards into Dracula's tomb, where he found the vampire's staked skeleton. Greedy and scheming to claim the castle for himself, Clifton removed the stake, accidentally resurrecting Dracula. The revived vampire overpowered him and cast him into a pit. Dracula, now fully restored, confronted Frank and Jeannie upstairs. Using his hypnotic powers, he ensnared Jeannie until Frank drove him off with her silver compact. The vampire then fed on a village girl, inciting the townsfolk to form a torch-bearing mob. Returning to the castle, Dracula attempted to attack Jeannie again, but she wore a crucifix, a trap laid by Frank. A brief struggle followed, though wounded by silver, Dracula escaped after overpowering Frank. As the villagers set the castle ablaze, Dracula hypnotized Jeannie into discarding her crucifix. He bit her once more before fleeing in bat form, when Frank struck him again with the silver compact. Frank carried Jeannie's lifeless body outside, believing her dead, but moments later she awakened, alive but transformed. Now a vampire herself, Jeannie rose, declared her new nature, and followed Dracula into the night, leaving Frank alone to grieve amid the burning ruins of Castle Dracula. Chapter 2. The Fear Within. Frank Drake returned to the scorched remains of Castle Dracula with his valet Gort, driven by vengeance against his undead ancestor for turning his beloved Jeannie into a vampire. Inside the tomb, Frank recounted the events that led to Dracula's resurrection, Jeannie's transformation, and the castle's fiery destruction. Their search through the ruins led them to Clifton Graves, trapped in a pit since the fire. After freeing him, Frank revealed the first step of his plan, stealing Dracula's coffin to lure him into a trap. Meanwhile, in the nearby village, Dracula hunted and killed a young woman before seeking out Karl von Harbu, a former servant who had betrayed him years earlier. Pretending to seek help concealing his pallor to pass as a human, Dracula allowed von Harbu to complete the task before draining his blood, revealing he had always known the man's identity. Days later, Frank and Clifton transported the stolen coffin to London. That night, Jeannie appeared, trying to seduce Frank into becoming her victim. Clifton interrupted, failing to recognize her vampiric nature until Frank brandished a crucifix, sending her recoiling in agony. Nearby, Dracula preyed on another woman, slaughtering her in a dark alley as horrified witnesses watched him transform into a bat and fly away. Back in his lair, Dracula mocked Frank's strategy, knowing it was not the coffin, but the Transylvanian soil within that sustained him. At Frank's flat, Jeannie, bound and weakened, continued manipulating Clifton, who betrayed Frank out of jealousy, drugging him and freeing her as Dracula arrived to reclaim his coffin. When Frank awoke, a violent struggle erupted. Dracula ordered Clifton to attack, but Jeannie soon turned on him, forcing Frank to stake her through the back with a shattered table leg. As dawn broke, Dracula fled in bat form. Exposed to sunlight, Jeannie burned away, her last words begging Frank not to let her die as he wept over her ashes. Chapter 3. Who Stalks the Vampire? Traumatized by his encounters with Count Dracula and the loss of his lover Jeannie, Frank Drake reached the edge of despair and attempted to end his life by leaping into the Thames. Before he could jump, he was stopped by Rachel Van Helsing, great-granddaughter of Abraham Van Helsing, and her companion Taj Natal. Rachel revealed she had been tracking him ever since learning he had inherited and later sold Castle Dracula. In the car, Frank confessed that he and his former friend, Clifton Graves, had inadvertently unleashed Dracula upon London. Elsewhere, Clifton, drunk and destitute, was confronted by Dracula himself. Mocking his role in resurrecting him, the vampire placed Clifton under hypnosis and ordered him to retrieve his coffin. While Dracula prowled London for fresh victims, Clifton set out to recover the coffin from the hotel he once shared with Frank. Meanwhile, Rachel decided this was the perfect opportunity to destroy Dracula. Armed with crucifixes and wooden stakes, she, Frank, and Taj headed for the hotel. In the storage area, a worker assisting Clifton accidentally dropped the coffin, revealing it was filled with gold coins. Overcome by greed, the man tried to pocket them but was immediately attacked and drained by Dracula. When the heroes arrived moments later, they found only the corpse inside the coffin. Then Dracula and Clifton ambushed them. During the scuffle, Clifton knocked away Rachel's crucifix, but she drove the vampire back with a crossbow loaded with wooden stakes. Dracula transformed into a bat and fled, with Clifton escaping after him and locking the heroes inside. Once Taj forced the door open, they were met by Scotland Yard, led by Inspector Chelm, who refused to believe their story. Later, when the porter's corpse revived as a vampire in the morgue, Rachel staked him before Chelm's eyes, convincing him of the truth. Meanwhile, Dracula arrived at the home of Ilsa Strangway, an aging former model who had purchased Castle Dracula. Obsessed with reclaiming her youth, Ilsa welcomed the vampire into her home, believing he could grant her the immortality she craved. Chapter 4. Through a Mirror Darkly. Count Dracula arrived at the home of Ilsa Strangway, an aging former model who had purchased Castle Dracula from Frank Drake, hoping to uncover its secrets to eternal youth. Dracula came to reclaim his property, but Ilsa held him off with a crucifix and offered him a deal. She confirmed the truth of Bram Stoker's tales and asked Dracula to grant her immortality in exchange for a dark mirror, an authentic occult artifact capable of bringing salvation. Tempted by the mirror, Dracula accepted and turned her into a vampire. Her screams alerted her butler, who found Dracula over her lifeless body and was easily overpowered. Later, in the hospital, he told his story to Frank Drake and Rachel Van Helsing, who joined Scotland Yard to investigate. They discovered Ilsa's body had vanished and began tracking her. Meanwhile, Clifton Graves had moved Dracula and Ilsa to an abandoned bunker for the day. At nightfall, Ilsa awoke as a vampire, immediately craving blood. When she tried to feed on Clifton, Dracula stopped her, claiming him as his servant. Ilsa revealed the mirror's true power to transport people through time, and Dracula, intrigued, spared her. The pair went hunting, leaving Clifton behind. Drake, Rachel, and Taj ambushed Clifton and learned their location. While Rachel placed crucifixes in the vampires' coffins, Frank and Taj prepared for Dracula's return at the mansion. That night, Ilsa hunted humans to restore her youth, while Dracula confronted Frank but was repelled by Taj's crucifix-shaped flashlight. Cornered, Dracula fled upstairs, seeking escape through the dark mirror. Back in the bunker, Ilsa returned to find Rachel waiting and realized the bitter truth. Vampirism had not restored her youth. When Clifton mocked her, she admitted she had deceived Dracula. The mirror could only send travelers to a time where it already existed. Otherwise, it led to a demonic realm. Accepting her fate, she begged Rachel to end her life, and Van Helsing staked her. Rachel rushed to the mansion only to arrive as Taj's struggle with Dracula sent them both crashing through the dark mirror. Chapter 5. Death to a Vampire Slayer. Rachel Van Helsing and Frank Drake arrived just as Dracula dragged Taj into the demonic mirror, vanishing into another realm. Inside, Dracula and Taj plummeted through a void and landed in a barren, infernal world swarming with grotesque creatures. Dracula fought off the monsters, invoking dark powers to repel them, and declared he would never submit. Realizing Ilsa's claims were true, that the mirror was demon-forged, he decided to find another escape. Though weakened and hungry, he protected Taj, intending to use him as food if necessary. After battling their way through the wasteland, they found a glowing ruin with another black mirror. Forcing Taj toward it, Dracula escaped back to Earth. They emerged in Transylvania, Centuries in the past, Dracula recognized his homeland and the age before Abraham Van Helsing had destroyed him. He imprisoned Taj in a coffin for later sustenance and hunted a passing woman to feed, regaining his strength. At dawn, he descended into the castle crypts and discovered a vial, the bottle of blood, containing Lenore, a woman he had long ago imprisoned in blood to keep her alive. As day broke, he left her and returned to his coffin to rest. The next morning, villagers found a young woman, Aura, dead from a vampire's bite. Terrified, they rallied to storm the castle. By nightfall, Dracula awoke, laughing that his prey was coming to him. He slaughtered the attackers, proclaiming himself ruler over the land. Meanwhile, Rachel, Frank, and Taj opened Ilsa's rusted safe, finding Dracula's grimoire and deducing he had traveled to Van Helsing's era. Using the spell, they followed him through time, landing in a tomb where they discovered Taj alive. Taking him to recover, they resolved to warn Abraham Van Helsing. Dracula freed Lenore, who attacked Rachel, but Taj and Frank used a marble cross's shadow to burn her. Dracula reached Van Helsing's manor and attacked, but Rachel's whitethorn arrow missed him. Transforming into a bat, he escaped with Lenore through the Black Mirror as Rachel vowed to follow him once more. Chapter 6: The Moorlands Monster. After passing through the Demon Mirror, Dracula and Lenore emerged from 19th century Transylvania into the fog-covered English moors of the modern day. Hungry, they hunted separately, Dracula feeding on a lone girl in the mist while Lenore preyed on a man leaving a pub, unaware that a mysterious, shaggy creature watched them. The creature later found Dracula's drained victim and carried her away. Meanwhile, Frank Drake, Rachel Van Helsing, and Taj returned through the mirror to their own time, learning from Ilsa Strangway's butler that Dracula had exited through another portal. Inspector Chelm soon reported mutilated bodies and sightings of a wild, shaggy man in the moors. Investigating, the hunters visited Lord and Lady Daring, who had discovered one of the corpses but knew little else. Splitting up to search, Rachel followed a trail of footprints and a swarm of bats into an old chapel, where Lenore ambushed her. Hearing Rachel's screams, Frank and Taj rushed in, finding Dracula and Lenore about to feed on her. When Frank fired a wooden stake, Dracula used Lenore as a shield. The projectile pierced her heart, killing her instantly. Dracula escaped amid the chaos, swearing vengeance, unaware the shaggy creature was stalking him through the moors. Back at Daring Manor, the hunters learned the beast's true origin. Lord Daring's son, Randolph, cursed by a hereditary condition that twisted his body and covered him in hair. Hidden in the chapel and tended by a servant girl, Dracula's first victim, Randolph had grown attached to her. Daring directed the hunters to Hagscroft Castle, where Dracula was likely hiding among its many tombs. There, the vampire ambushed them, hurling a stone lid to knock Taj unconscious, and imprisoning Frank and Rachel in a pit. Before sealing them in, Dracula mocked their shared bloodline and hinted that Frank might one day become a vampire. In the darkness, Frank and Rachel finally confessed their feelings and kissed. They were saved by the monster of the moors, who lifted the lid and freed them. With Taj revived and Dracula vanished, the trio followed their strange savior out of the castle, Frank haunted by Dracula's parting words. Chapter 7: Night of the Deathstalkers. On a snowy London night, Dracula returned in bat form, hunting for prey. He attacked a young woman named Edith Harker, unaware she was the granddaughter of his old enemy, Jonathan Harker. When her crucifix repelled him, Dracula knocked her unconscious and summoned a swarm of rats to devour her. Before the creatures could reach her, Edith's father, the wheelchair-bound vampire hunter Quincy Harker, arrived with his dog Saint, driving off the rats and rescuing his daughter. Realizing Dracula had resurfaced, Quincy contacted Rachel Van Helsing. Meanwhile, Dracula returned to his lair where his thrall, Clifton Graves, awaited. The vampire lord predicted that Frank Drake, Rachel, and Taj would soon track him down, and struck Clifton for showing cowardice. His intuition proved right. The trio received Quincy's telegram and journeyed from Lord Daring's estate to London. On the train, Rachel told Frank about Quincy's lineage and the generations of Harkers and Van Helsings who had fought Dracula. At Quincy's fortified home, the group met the aging hunter, who displayed his ingenious anti-vampire weaponry and asked Frank to join their crusade. Frank agreed, vowing to fight until the end. Elsewhere, Dracula awakened and plotted his next move. Roaming the streets, he encountered a group of children at play and, using hypnotic power, enslaved them to serve as assassins. Later, he sent them to Clifton's residence while he hunted again, feeding on a drunken man driven toward him by hordes of rats. The man's dying screams brought Quincy and the others racing to the scene. They clashed with Dracula but failed to stop him, as he dissolved into mist and fled. Piling into Quincy's car, they pursued him to his hideout, finding what seemed to be Dracula's sleeping body. When they attempted to stake him, the corpse proved to be a decoy. The real Dracula appeared behind them, laughing and unleashing his hypnotized army of children before escaping into the night, just as Quincy struck him with a poisoned dart. Chapter 8. The Hellcrawlers. After being struck by Quincy Harker's poison-tipped dart, Dracula fled in agony, knowing the toxin couldn't kill him, but would torment him eternally unless purged. When his servant Clifton Graves tried to help, Dracula violently cast him aside and escaped in bat form, desperate for relief. Crashing through the window of Dr. Heinrich Morta's office, Dracula reverted to human form and collapsed. Horrified onlookers were dismissed as Heinrich took him in. Meanwhile, at Graves' home, the hypnotized children Dracula had enslaved attacked Quincy, Rachel Van Helsing, Frank Drake, and Taj. Unwilling to harm the innocents, Quincy ordered the lights extinguished to mask their escape. Rachel slipped through a window, encountered Clifton, and fought him off long enough to unlock the door, freeing her companions. They locked the children inside and fled, knowing they would soon break out and resume the hunt. At Morta's clinic, Dracula demanded a full blood transfusion to cleanse the poison. When Heinrich refused, Dracula threatened to expose his secret, that he too was a vampire, to his daughter Adrienne. Reluctantly, Heinrich performed the procedure. As Dracula recovered, he forced Heinrich to lead him to a hidden device called the projector, capable of resurrecting corpses as zombie vampires. Back at Quincy's stalled car, the children surrounded and attacked, shattering the windows with stone. Their assault ended when Edith Harker arrived by helicopter, using a sonic weapon to render the children unconscious. Quincy reassured her that they would awaken free of Dracula's control, then sent the team to await Dracula's return at his lair. Meanwhile, in a cemetery, Dracula and Heinrich activated the projector, only for Adrienne to discover them. Overcome with guilt, Heinrich confessed his vampirism. When Dracula commanded his undead army to slay her, Heinrich seized the device, transformed into a bat, and fled. Dracula gave chase, but in the struggle, Heinrich smashed the projector, destroying the risen vampires. Choosing death, Heinrich impaled himself on the cemetery fence, and Dracula, thwarted again, fled into the night as Adrienne wept over her father's body. Chapter 9. Death from the Sea. In the quiet village of Littlepool, a fisherman's net hauled in a pale, lifeless body. Unbeknownst to all, it was Count Dracula. Believing him dead, the locals brought him to the village church, run by Father William. When the priest thought he saw the corpse move, he dismissed it as imagination. But that night, Dracula awoke, horrified to find himself surrounded by crucifixes. In pain, he transformed into a bat and tried to escape, but weakened, he reverted to human form and fled the church. The villagers were stunned to see the dead man alive. Dracula, hiding his identity, recalled how he ended up in the water. After leaving the corpse of Heinrich Morta, he had tried to feed on a pair of lovers but was struck by lingering poison, forcing him to flee. A biker gang found him, beat him, and dumped him into the river, thinking him dead. Introducing himself to Father William as Mr. Drake, Dracula claimed to be recovering from illness. When invited to stay in the church, he refused but accepted lodging from a young man named David and his mother Martha. David planned to leave the dull village despite his girlfriend Andrea's protests. Dracula learned of David's restlessness, sympathized, and took the guest room, though he discarded the food offered, longing only for blood. That night, he prowled for prey and killed a bartender named Gladys, who later rose as a vampire and fed on her admirer Corker. Dracula soon met David again, who asked to join him when he left town. Before he could respond, Andrea's screams rang out. Corker had attacked her. Dracula intervened, commanding Gladys and Corker to retreat. Father William, having witnessed this, rallied the villagers to destroy the vampire. Confronted by David, Dracula admitted the truth and urged him to protect his family as he escaped in bat form. The mob killed Gladys and Corker soon after. When Dracula reappeared to thank David for his help, the young man refused to assist him further. Impressed, Dracula departed into the mist, leaving the boy and Andrea unharmed. Chapter 10. His name is Blade. On the fog-drenched docks of London, a young couple preparing to flee to America was attacked by 3 vampires calling themselves members of Dracula's Legion. Before they could feed, the trio was ambushed by Blight, a fierce vampire hunter armed with wooden throwing knives. In a swift and brutal fight, Blight staked and killed all 3 vampires. His victory was short-lived as he was confronted by Quincy Harker and his daughter Edith. Quincy reprimanded Blight for killing Dracula's followers, arguing they could have led them to the Count. Blight dismissed the warning, declaring he would hunt and kill Dracula his own way. Meanwhile, aboard a luxury cruise ship owned by wealthy socialite Gabriel Trulaine, the real Count Dracula mingled among the elite. Pretending to be his own descendant afflicted with a rare blood disease, he captured the guests, particularly the women. Retiring to his cabin with his servant Clifton Graves, Dracula revealed his true goal: to dominate and control the influential passengers for his purposes. He soon lured one of the women away, fed on her, and left her under Graves' supervision while he moved to seize control of the ship. Using hypnosis, Dracula enthralled the captain and jolted the vessel to command attention. He then revealed his true identity to the horrified guests, declaring they would all become his slaves. When one man fired at him, Dracula shrugged off the bullets and hurled him overboard. But a guest armed with a crucifix forced Dracula back, while the bitten woman awoke, entranced, and knocked Clifton unconscious before wandering in search of her lover. As chaos erupted, Dracula fled in mist form, only to encounter Blight, who had tracked him aboard. The two clashed savagely, their duel interrupted when the hypnotized woman and Clifton appeared. Enraged by the distraction, Dracula hurled the woman aside and announced he had ordered the ship's destruction before escaping as a bat. Blight led the passengers to safety, but Clifton remained, pleading for mercy as the ship exploded. From afar, Dracula vowed vengeance against Blight, promising their next battle would be the hunter's last. Chapter 11. The Voodoo Man. After his violent clash with Blight, Dracula fled through the night towards Surrey Forest, racing against the coming dawn to reach the mortuary where his coffin lay hidden. Exhausted, he vowed revenge on the biker gang that had assaulted him days earlier before retreating into his slumber. Meanwhile, in London, Lucas Brand, the leader of that very gang, was visiting Jason Faust, a wealthy man confined to an iron lung. Faust, embittered and crippled, hired Brand to intimidate banker Oliver Gordon, who had refused to release funds that might have saved him from paralysis. Brand and his gang sped off to Gordon's bank, splashing Frank Drake and Rachel Van Helsing as they passed. Rachel calmed Frank's temper, suggesting they attend a stage play about Dracula to unwind. At the bank, Brand accused Gordon of causing Faust's suffering. When Gordon threatened them with a security camera, Brand used a special signal watch to alert Faust, who stabbed a voodoo doll in Gordon's likeness, instantly killing him. The gang destroyed the camera and fled. That night, Dracula awoke and, wandering London's foggy streets, witnessed a knife-wielding man stalking a woman. Choosing the predator over the prey, Dracula drained the prowler's blood and vanished into the mist. At his mansion, Faust recounted to Brand how he became imprisoned in the Iron Lung. Years earlier, on a business trip to Haiti arranged by Quincy Harker, Faust was captured by a voodoo priest named Malawi and tortured with dark magic. Though rescued, the trauma left him paralyzed. Now he sought vengeance on Harker and his former partner, Lastman. Dracula hunted the bikers and learned they had already helped Faust kill Lastman. Meanwhile, Brand and his men stormed Quincy Harker's home, but before Faust could activate the voodoo doll made in Quincy's image, Dracula smashed through the window. The vampire lord slaughtered the gang and spared only Brand, turning him into a vampire and sending him back to Faust. When Brand attacked his master, Faust drove a pin into a voodoo doll made in Brand's likeness, killing him, only to realize too late that he had been turned into a vampire himself as sunlight streamed into the room. Chapter 12. Night of the Screaming House. Dracula nearly claimed young Elizabeth Langley as his latest victim when Quincy Harker and his vampire hunting team, his daughter Edith, Frank Drake, Rachel Van Helsing, and Taj Natal, arrived to stop him. Despite their combined assault, Dracula overpowered them and seized Edith. When Frank tried to intervene, the vampire lord struck him aside and taunted Quincy, promising to reveal Edith's location the following night at midnight. If Harker failed to come, he warned, Edith would die. Transforming into a bat, Dracula flew off with his captive. Dracula brought Edith to his mortuary lair, vowing to avenge years of persecution by Quincy Harker. He later contacted the hunters, instructing them to meet him at an abandoned mansion called Whispering Hell. Simultaneously, Dracula reached out to Blade, goading him into a confrontation. Ignoring his partner Saffron's pleas, Blade set out alone. Inside the decrepit mansion, Quincy's group lit torches to navigate the darkness. When Frank stepped through a rotten stair plank, he disturbed a swarm of bats that slashed Rachel's face. Quincy and Taj fought them off as Frank and Rachel spotted Dracula leading Edith away. Leaving Rachel behind to recover, Frank and Taj followed the trail. Finding Edith's embroidered handkerchief, Blade suddenly appeared, startling Frank, who nearly shot him. Their argument was cut short when venomous tarantulas crept toward Frank. Blade saved him by rolling the spiders in a rug and flinging them aside. Meanwhile, Taj discovered Edith's hiding place but was struck unconscious by Dracula. Hearing her screams, Blade charged in and fought Dracula, their struggle crashing through the halls. Dracula hurled Blade over a railing, but the hunter caught a chandelier to save himself. Frank attacked with a fire axe, but Dracula easily subdued him, until Blade recovered and slashed the vampire's face with his wooden daggers. Enraged, Dracula smashed through a window and escaped in bat form. Moments later, Edith, now turned into a vampire, begged them to kill her before she lost control. She threw herself from the balcony, and a grieving Quincy drove a stake through her heart. Watching Dracula flee, Frank vowed to destroy him once and for all. Chapter 13. To kill a vampire. After being forced to kill his daughter Edith, Quincy Harker was left grief-stricken. Frank Drake, consumed by rage, demanded to pursue Dracula immediately. When he lashed out at Blade, the vampire hunter brushed it off, urging the group to cremate Edith's body before continuing the hunt, an idea Quincy reluctantly accepted. Meanwhile, Dracula wandered through London and encountered a thug named Skinny, harassing a woman named Cecile. Dracula killed Skinny and hypnotized Cecile, feeding on her but leaving her alive to serve him later. Deciding to study humanity before conquering it, he visited a crowded sports arena, disgusted by the brutality and spectacle of a boxing match. Elsewhere at Scotland Yard, a man named Mr. Lowe arrived on behalf of his master, Dr. Sun. Bribing the attendant, he retrieved the body of Lucas Brand from the morgue, murdering the staffer to erase all evidence. Later that night, after Edith's cremation, Blade opened up about his past. He revealed he hunted vampires because one had killed his mother during childbirth. The attending doctor had been a vampire who fed on her mid-delivery, leaving the newborn Blade untouched but forever changed. He told Quincy's team they had no right to judge how he mourned the dead. As Dracula flew back to his mortuary lair in bat form, Scotland Yard tracked his movements and alerted Quincy Harker. The hunters rushed to the area, questioning a postmaster who fell into a hypnotic trance when shown Dracula's likeness. Realizing the vampire was nearby, they converged on the mortuary as night fell. When Dracula rose, his psychic bond with enthralled townsfolk warned him of their approach. As Harker and his allies broke in, Dracula summoned his human thralls to defend him. However, the hunters overwhelmed him before his servants arrived. In a final clash, Blade drove a wooden stake through Dracula's heart, ending the battle in the mortuary. Chapter 14. Dracula is dead. Blade succeeded in killing Dracula by driving a wooden dagger through his heart, but before the vampire hunters could destroy the body, villagers still under Dracula's hypnotic control stormed the mortuary. They overpowered Quincy Harker, Frank Drake, Rachel Van Helsing, Taj Natal, and Blade, carrying off Dracula's corpse. The hunters feared the thralls might somehow restore him to life. Meanwhile, along the Irish coast, Mr. Lowe delivered the corpse of the vampire Lucas Brand to his master, Dr. Sun. In a secret laboratory, Lowe conducted experiments on the body, confirming that Brand was indeed a true vampire. Back in London, as the hunters regrouped, they found Taj alive, having survived being hurled from a window during the earlier battle. The group set off in pursuit of Dracula's missing remains. Elsewhere, Dracula's corpse, placed in a coffin by his mindless followers, began to crumble into skeletal remains. When the body reduced to bones, the villagers awoke from their trance, panicked, and fled, leaving the coffin abandoned. Not far away, Father Josiah Dawn, the disillusioned leader of a failing revival ministry, called the Church of the Forever Resurrected, questioned his faith and pleaded with God for a sign. Moments later, he discovered Dracula's coffin. Believing it divine intervention, he announced to the press that at his next revival, he would raise a man from the dead. When news of this reached Quincy and his team, they were horrified to learn that the dead man was Dracula. At the revival, a packed crowd watched as Father Dawn, consumed with zeal, removed the dagger from Dracula's chest, despite Blade's desperate warnings. Dracula regenerated before the stunned audience, mocking the priest's folly. As terrified worshippers brandished crucifixes, Dracula turned to mist and escaped the holy symbols. Furious, he summoned a lightning storm. When Dawn confronted him with a massive cross, Dracula called down lightning to destroy it, fatally striking the priest. As Josiah died, he vowed his soul would outlast the vampire's evil. Enraged, Dracula transformed into a bat and flew off into the storm, leaving the preacher's body behind. Chapter 15. Fear is the name of the game. Recovering from his recent near-death, Dracula hid in London, brooding over his escape from the hunters after killing Reverend Josiah Dawn. Taking flight as a bat, he was suddenly shot from the sky by a hunter named Vinny. Startled by the strange creature, Vinny kept the bat as a trophy, until Dracula revived and attacked in fury. Vinny fled into the woods, but Dracula summoned rats, wolves, and bats to tear him apart. His thoughts drifted back to his origins, to Turok, the invader who conquered his land, gave him to a gypsy that cursed him with vampirism, and murdered his wife, Maria. Dracula remembered with grim satisfaction how he had later turned Turok into a vampire himself. Thinking of Maria led him to ponder human cruelty and the nature of love. He recalled finding a couple, Richard and Kitty, locked in bitter conflict. When Kitty demanded a divorce, Richard shot her in cold blood, revealing he had only married her for money. As she lay dying, Dracula offered her vengeance. She accepted and he transformed her into a vampire. Returning home, Kitty found Richard with another woman and drained him of blood. Dracula's reflections turned to deceit. He remembered Orpheus, an old man who summoned him, claiming knowledge of a mystical pool of blood that could restore youth. Tempted by the idea, Dracula accompanied him. At the pool, Orpheus revealed the truth, that the pool granted immortality, not youth, and, weary of eternal life, he destroyed it and himself using a magic medallion, leaving Dracula enraged and empty-handed. Finishing his musings, Dracula recalled the night his body became skeletal remains. On the evening of humanity's first moon landing, he had arranged to relocate coffins to London. Returning to his castle, he fought a Scotsman who impaled him through the heart. Before death, Dracula hurled his foe into a pit, then collapsed into his coffin as his flesh dissolved from his bones. Emerging from his reflections, he reminded himself that no matter how often he was slain, Dracula always returned. Death could never truly claim him. Chapter 16. Return from the Grave. A cloaked skeleton broke into the home of James Jackson, killing his secretary, Helen Cantler, when she caught it robbing the safe. Jackson rushed in and met the same fate as the creature stole an unknown item and fled. Soon after, Inspector Chelm and Scotland Yard arrived to investigate the double murder. Meanwhile, in Highgate Cemetery, Dracula rose at night to feed. Finding two grave robbers opening a coffin, he prepared to strike, but was startled when the corpse within sprang to life and killed them before disintegrating into ash. Infuriated, Dracula compelled the cemetery keeper to bury the bodies and then went out hunting, feeding on a young woman named Marie Comte. At Scotland Yard, Chelm, suspecting Dracula's involvement, contacted Quincy Harker, who doubted the killings matched Dracula's methods but offered assistance. Chelm's next report detailed new attacks on Coventry Street, where the skeletal killers slaughtered several pubgoers while pursuing a woman wearing a special necklace. Dracula arrived, recognizing the creature as the one who had ruined his earlier hunt, and attacked it. The monster overpowered him, stole the necklace, and vanished. Dracula fled in bat form when police opened fire. Elsewhere in Ireland, Mr. Chen presented a reanimated Lucas Brand to Dr. Sun, proving vampire's existence. Pleased, Dr. Sun granted Chen's request to free his father from a Chinese prison. Back in London, Dracula returned to Highgate and uncovered the creature's grave. Inside the coffin, the skeleton attacked again before crumbling to dust. The tombstone read, Paul Bear, a Satanist and mystic Dracula once knew. Chelm's investigation revealed that the victims, Bear and a man named Duncan Corley, were linked. Arriving at Bear's home, Dracula found his corpse with a note reading, "Do not bury him again." Bringing the body back to Highgate, Dracula confronted the skeletal Corley as Chelm arrived. After a fierce fight, Chelm explained that Bear had stolen Corley's burial plot, causing supernatural retribution. Accepting this, Dracula took Corley's corpse to return it to its rightful grave. Chapter 17. Death Rides the Rails. After a stay in Paris, Dracula returned to one of his hidden coffins lined with Transylvanian earth, only to find it destroyed, one of many recent desecrated by vampire hunters. Enraged and desperate for rest, he was attacked by Blight, who had been responsible for the destruction. Though Blight fought fiercely, Dracula overpowered him, fed on him, and left him for dead before fleeing to a farmhouse in France owned by his human servant Henry Verne and his wife Gerta, where another coffin awaited. The following night, Dracula began his journey back to Transylvania aboard a train crossing through Germany. He secured a private cabin and hypnotized the conductor to allow no interruptions. Also aboard the train were Frank Drake and Rachel Van Helsing, who had tracked him and a man named Gruber, accompanied by his bodyguard Granette, guarding a mysterious briefcase they feared a pursuer might try to steal. As Dracula prowled the train in search of prey, he briefly passed a young man named Jack Russell, unaware of the werewolf's future importance. Dracula found a mother and her child, lured the woman to his cabin, and fed on her. Her screams alerted Drake, Rachel, Gruber, and Granite, forcing Dracula to retreat in mist form before killing her. Cursing his mistake, Dracula returned to his room, where Gruber and Granite tricked him into opening the door. Granite fired a gun, but the bullets were useless. Dracula hurled him from the moving train, believing both men worked for Quincy Harker. Gruber fled, clutching the briefcase. Dracula pursued, but was interrupted by Drake and Rachel. He fought his way past them, vowing they would die at Castle Dracula. Catching up to Gruber, Dracula mocked his important documents, prompting the terrified man to leap through a window to his death. Before Dracula could investigate, Rachel reappeared with a crossbow, forcing him to flee into the night sky. Farther down the line, Gruber's corpse was found by an agent of Dr. Sun, who recovered the briefcase and reported the success of his mission to his mysterious master. Chapter 18. Enter Werewolf by Night. Jack Russell and his lover Topaz traveled to Transylvania, seeking a cure for Jack's werewolf curse, unaware that Dracula had returned home that same night after his long stay in London. In Castle Dracula, the vampire lord gazed upon portraits of himself and his lost wife, Maria, reflecting on the tragic events that transformed him into a creature of the night. Meanwhile, in the Paris catacombs, Quincy Harker discovered Blade's lifeless body, bitten by Dracula. Believing his ally dead, Harker prepared to stake him to prevent vampiric resurrection. In Transylvania, Jack and Topaz stopped at the Old Boot Inn. There, a drunken sailor named Scratcher made an advance toward Topaz, prompting Jack to punch him. Humiliated, Scratcher swore revenge. Later that night, Jack warned Topaz to lock her door, as the full moon would trigger his transformation. Ignoring the warning, Scratcher entered Topaz's room to attack Jack, only to find the werewolf waiting. The beast killed him, hurling his body into the bar below. Topaz calmed the werewolf, urging him to flee before discovery. Dracula, witnessing the fight, descended to confront them. Attempting to feed on Topaz, he recoiled in pain under her psychic gaze. When he lashed out, the enraged werewolf attacked him. Dracula easily overpowered the creature, but was again driven off by Topaz's mysterious power. The next day, Jack and Topaz visited Russoff Manor, Jack's ancestral home, seeking answers about his curse. Discovering his father's diary and a hidden passage behind a bookshelf, they followed it to a cavern beneath Castle Dracula. Jack realized his father had studied the vampire lord through a telescope aimed at the castle and resolved to investigate further. That night, Dracula prepared coffins for shipment back to London and swore to declare open war on humanity. Spotting Jack and Topaz approaching, he swooped down. As the moon rose, Jack transformed again, but Dracula seized Topaz and carried her into the castle, demanding to know the secret of her powers. When the werewolf burst in, Dracula struck her aside and prepared to feed on the beast. Crossover: Werewolf by Night, Death of a Monster. Jack and Topaz, seeking a cure for Jack's werewolf curse, found themselves trapped inside Castle Dracula. The vampire lord had abducted Topaz, forcing the feral werewolf to battle him. Dracula easily overpowered the beast and prepared to drink its blood, but Topaz's psychic power struck him with intense pain, giving the werewolf an opening to fight back. The struggle sent Dracula tumbling off a balcony, and he fled into the night to find another victim. While Dracula fed on a young woman nearby, Topaz managed to lead the werewolf out of the castle before he returned. At the same time, Frank Drake and Rachel Van Helsing arrived in a helicopter, intent on destroying Dracula. Spotting him flying towards his castle in bat form, they pursued him, but Dracula attacked mid-air, forcing their helicopter into a tailspin. They regained control, narrowly avoiding a crash, while Dracula escaped. The next morning at Russoff Manor, Jack reverted to human form. Using her powers, Topaz unlocked Gregory Russoff's diary, which told the origin of the werewolf curse. In the 1700s, Gregor Russoff's first wife was slain by Dracula. Seeking revenge, Russoff staked Dracula during the day, lined his coffin with garlic, and threw it into a river. In the aftermath, Russoff found a captive woman named Lydia, who revealed she had been imprisoned by Dracula. He freed her, only for her to transform into a werewolf under the full moon and bite him, passing on the curse. Jack realized this meant Dracula had no power over werewolves. Meanwhile, Dracula returned to his castle, where he ambushed Frank and Rachel, learning they had found the diary. Deciding to retrieve it, he plotted to sabotage their helicopter. That night, as Jack again transformed, Topaz guided him to confront Dracula. The werewolf attacked the vampire before he could destroy the helicopter. During the fight, Dracula seized the diary from Topaz, but Rachel's crossbow knocked it free. As Rachel and Frank escaped with the book, Dracula turned into a bat to pursue them, leaving Topaz and the werewolf behind. Chapter 19. Snowbound in Hell. Rachel Van Helsing found herself stranded in the frozen Transylvanian Alps with her greatest enemy, Count Dracula. The two, bound by necessity, were forced into an uneasy alliance to survive the brutal winter. Rachel needed Dracula's strength to navigate the deadly terrain, while Dracula relied on her companionship to avoid starving in the wasteland, as human prey was scarce. After Rachel nearly fell from a cliff, Dracula saved her and they took shelter in a cave. As Rachel rested, Dracula hunted and reluctantly fed on a mountain goat, disgusted by the taste of non-human blood. He then reflected on how they ended up in this predicament. After battling the werewolf, Rachel had stolen the second book of sins and fled in a helicopter. Dracula pursued, leaping aboard mid-air and forcing the craft off course. The pilot fell to his death and the helicopter crashed deep in the Alps. Realizing that both their lives now depended on each other's survival, Dracula had tended to Rachel's wounds. He later returned with the goat carcass so Rachel could cook her meal. They discussed their shared hatred and acknowledged their temporary stalemate. If one killed the other, neither would survive. Meanwhile, in Ireland, Mr. Lowe continued training the vampire Lucas Brand under Dr. Soon's supervision. And in Paris, Quincy Harker stood over Blade's apparently lifeless body, ready to stake him, only for Blade to awaken unharmed. Blade revealed that he was immune to vampirism because his mother had been bitten while giving birth, and vowed to use his immunity to exterminate all vampires. Back in the Alps, Rachel attempted to stake Dracula while he rested, but he anticipated the move and overpowered her. Forcing her onward through the storm, they were attacked by a mountain ram, and Rachel reluctantly shot it to save them both. Just then, Frank Drake arrived in a helicopter searching for Rachel. Seeing her run toward rescue, Dracula attacked, trying to feed on her before she could escape. Frank opened fire with wooden bullets, driving Dracula away. Frank pulled Rachel aboard the helicopter and flew off toward Transylvania, leaving Dracula stranded in the snowbound wilderness. Chapter 20. The Coming of Dr. Sun. Dracula, weakened and stranded in the Transylvanian Alps after his last meal, a mountain goat, struggled to survive while being hunted by Frank Drake and Rachel Van Helsing in a helicopter. Rachel explained to Frank that the vampire lord was at his weakest point in years. Spotting Dracula below, they opened fire with wooden bullets, enraging him. Viewing such a death as beneath his dignity, Dracula fled into the mountains, desperate to find blood to regain his strength. He detected a faint human scent, but discovered only a corpse frozen by exposure. Starved and desperate, Dracula drank the dead man's blood, finding it foul. Pressing deeper into a cave, he uncovered a stash of gold and jewels, cursing their worthlessness to his survival. Meanwhile, aboard the helicopter, Frank asked Rachel why she was so devoted to killing Dracula. Rachel recounted how her father, Abraham Van Helsing, had been Dracula's nemesis. Years later, the vampire returned for vengeance, killing Abraham and Rachel's parents. Before he could kill her, Quincy Harker intervened, driving Dracula off with his weaponized wheelchair. Quincy took Rachel in and trained her as a vampire hunter. When no trace of Dracula was found, they left the area. Emerging from hiding, Dracula tried to escape in bat form, but was too weak to fly in the storm and crashed into the snow. His last sight before losing consciousness was a man standing above him. In Ireland, Lucas Brand completed his training and was brought before Dr. Sons, revealed to be a brain encased in a glass container. Elsewhere, Dracula awoke to a pillar surrounded by garlic. He was greeted by Professor Morgo, Dr. Sons' assistant, who revealed they had hunted him for years with help from Clifton Graves, Dracula's former servant. Graves, horribly scarred but alive thanks to Dr. Sons, mocked Dracula until the vampire kicked him in rage. Morgo intervened by temporarily impaling Dracula. When Frank and Rachel discovered the structure, Dracula broke free, killing Morgo and feeding on his blood. He used Graves as a shield against Rachel's arrows, killing him as well. Before the hunters could strike again, Dr. Sons arrived with Brand and paralyzed them, declaring his intention to challenge Dracula for the throne of the vampire race. Chapter 21. Death Knell. Frank Drake, Rachel Van Helsing, and Dracula were captured by Dr. Sons and his servant, the vampire Lucas Brand. Dr. Sons, who had long sought to claim Dracula's mantle as Lord of the Vampires, revealed his origins through Brand's recounting. In 1966, during China's Cultural Revolution, Dr. Sons had been a brilliant scientist imprisoned by his own government and forced into a horrific experiment. His brain was removed and placed in an antimatter containment vessel, wired into a computer to serve as a living weapon. The experiment backfired when Dr. Sons' immense mental power destroyed his captors. To survive, he required constant infusions of fresh blood, and learning of vampires, he became obsessed with mastering and controlling them, creating his own army to achieve global dominion. After recounting his history, Dr. Sons ordered Lucas Brand to drain Rachel Van Helsing's blood. However, before Brand could obey, Sun released Dracula as a test of Brand's strength. The two vampires clashed savagely, with Brand impaling Dracula through the heart using a wooden stake. Meanwhile, in London, Quincy Harker urged Blade to remain with their group, but Blade refused, determined to pursue the vampire who had murdered his mother. Back in Dr. Sons' fortress, Dracula was revived and connected to a machine, his body wired to extract his knowledge and powers. Dr. Sons explained that he planned to use Dracula's memories to control the vampire race through Lucas Brand. When Lucas was linked into the machine, much of Dracula's essence was transferred into him. Drunk with new power, Brand broke free, declaring his intent to destroy Dracula. A furious battle erupted. Dracula, weakened, regained his strength by feeding on one of Dr. Sons' scientists. Dr. Sun, deeming Brand a failure, freed Rachel and Frank to arm themselves. As the two vampires fought, Brand hurled Dracula into the machinery, triggering massive explosions. Brand shattered the hunter's weapons before turning on Dr. Sons, who struck him down with a psychic blast. As the laboratory burned, Dr. Sons teleported away. Frank and Rachel escaped by helicopter, believing Dracula dead, but the vampire lord survived, transforming into a bat and fleeing seconds before the mountain erupted in flames. Chapter 22. In Death Do We Join? In the quiet Moldavian village of Kamenka, Ulsa and Peter Vornik were jolted awake one night by the terrified screams of their daughter, Petra, who was being attacked by her ex-husband, Gorna, now a vampire. Peter rushed to her aid, managing to drive Gorna away as the undead man vowed to return and claim Petra as his own. Not far away, Dracula emerged from the Alps, starving and weak. Seeking sustenance, he found a young couple in a bar, killed the man, and fed upon the woman to regain his strength. At the Vornik home, Petra awoke shaken but safe. She revealed the tragic story of her marriage. Gorna had been a cruel, jealous husband who once murdered a man simply for speaking to her. When Gorna fell ill, he swore on his deathbed that if she ever saw another man, he would kill him. After his funeral, a former suitor who had visited Petra was found dead, and she realized the horrifying truth. Gorna had returned from the grave as a vampire. Meanwhile, Dracula reached the local cemetery where he encountered Gorna. Defiant and arrogant, Gorna refused to recognize Dracula as the king of vampires. When Dracula moved to punish him, Gorna summoned lightning from the sky, striking Dracula before fleeing. Enraged, Dracula swore vengeance and set out to destroy the insolent fledgling. That same night, Gorna broke into the Vornik home again to attack Petra. Peter rushed in and drove a flaming stake into Gorna's chest, forcing him to retreat, badly burned. Moments later, Dracula arrived, knocked Peter aside, and hypnotized Petra to learn what had transpired. Determined to end Gorna's defiance, Dracula followed the trail to the cemetery. In London, Frank Drake and Rachel Van Helsing informed Quincy Harker that they believed Dracula perished in their last battle. Quincy revealed that he had been attacked by a woman claiming to be Dracula's daughter, and that Taj had left for India. Back in Kamenka, Dracula found the scarred Gorna. As villagers gathered and lit massive fires, the two vampires fought fiercely. Dracula overpowered Gorna and hurled him into the flames, leaving the burning cemetery behind. Crossover, Curse of Dracula, Night of the She-Demon. In London, Dracula met with Lord Henry, a politician under his hypnotic control, to ensure his safety from the authorities. He demanded diplomatic immunity and discussed purchasing a castle outside London owned by Sheila Whittier. Meanwhile, in a northern cemetery, a grave stirred for the first time in 3 decades. Nearby, Martin O'Hara brutally beat his daughter Angela for getting pregnant by her boyfriend, Ted Hannigan. When Ted tried to defend her, Martin struck him fatally. As Angela wept over Ted's body, the spirit of Lilith, Dracula's daughter, rose from a grave and possessed her, transforming Angela's body into Lilith's own. She then killed Martin and flew away in bat form. At Quincy Harker's home, Quincy received a call from Frank Drake and Rachel Van Helsing, who reported Dracula's apparent death in an explosion. Relieved, Quincy shared the news with Taj, who soon left for India after reading a letter from his homeland. Later that night, Lilith, disguised as a grieving woman, came to Quincy's home pretending to need help. When his back was turned, she revealed her true form and fed on him, leaving him unconscious but alive. That same night, Dracula arrived at Castle Dunwich, awakening Sheila Whittier, a scarred and frightened woman. Mistaking him for one of her past tormentors, she submitted to him, but Dracula assured her otherwise. When he prepared to leave, he noticed another bat in the sky, his daughter Lilith, and pursued her to London. At a football match, father and daughter confronted each other. Lilith reminded Dracula of their tragic past. Her mother, Zofia, was exiled by Dracula centuries ago and sought refuge with Leanda, the gypsy who cursed Dracula into vampirism. When Dracula later killed Leanda's son, she cursed Lilith to become an immortal vampire, whose existence would bring him eternal torment. Lilith proposed an alliance to rule together, but Dracula refused and departed. Swearing vengeance, Lilith vanished into the night. Back at Castle Dunwich, Dracula saved Sheila from falling down the stairs and discovered her tormentor, Lord Henry. Under Dracula's control, Henry confessed to torturing her and, overcome with guilt, shot himself dead. Chapter 23, Shadows in the Night. Dracula and Sheila Whittier stood over the body of Lord Henry, the politician who had served under Dracula's control and whom they believed to be responsible for Sheila's torment. However, as they discussed the night's events, Sheila suddenly suffered a mysterious cut across her face, making Dracula realize Henry was not the true cause of her suffering. He took Sheila to bed to rest, deciding she would make a far more suitable companion than his late servant Clifton Graves. As he reflected on his recent encounter with Lilith, a sudden knock at the door interrupted him. When Dracula opened it, he found no one there, only a powerful unseen force dragging him outside. Meanwhile, in Jajpur, India, Taj Natal arrived home for a long overdue reunion with his wife after years away with Quincy Harker's group. Back in London, Dracula battled the phantom presence attempting to overpower him. The disturbance awakened Sheila, who screamed as more spectral forces filled the mansion. Dracula rushed to her aid, and she revealed that she was being haunted by the ghost of Alistar Dunwich. Sheila explained that she inherited the mansion after the deaths of her uncle and aunt. She had moved in with her lover Freddy, but her unease grew when Freddy was mysteriously pushed down the stairs to his death by invisible hands. Leaving Sheila to recover, Dracula went out to feed. On a dark country road, he allowed a passing car to strike him and then drained the blood of its driver, Caroline Bascom, when she stopped to check on him. While Dracula was gone, Sheila wandered the mansion and was confronted by the spirit of Alistar Dunwich himself. He revealed he was not her uncle, but her father, murdered for inheritance, and that he had once sold his soul, intending to sacrifice Sheila's in exchange for his own freedom. When she refused, Alistar tried to kill her by hurling objects through the air. Dracula returned in time, destroyed the animated corpses, and hurled Dunwic's body against a wall, banishing his spirit back to hell. Chapter 24. A Night for the Living, a Mourning for the Dead. On a bridge overlooking the Thames River, Frank Drake reflected with Rachel Van Helsing on the moment 3 years earlier when he had nearly taken his own life from that same spot. He admitted he still questioned whether being saved by Rachel and Taj was truly a blessing, and wondered what direction his life should now take, believing that Dracula was finally dead. However, in the shadows of London, Dracula was very much alive. He prowled the streets searching for fresh prey while his new familiar, Sheila Whittier, remained at Castle Dunwick, unaware of her master's true, monstrous nature. Elsewhere in the city, Blade returned to the apartment he shared with his girlfriend Saffron and found a vampire attacking her. With swift precision, Blade destroyed the creature. Shortly after, Saffron's fellow showgirl Trudy arrived, and Saffron explained her terrifying encounter earlier that night. While performing on stage, she noticed Dracula watching her from the audience. After her show, the vampire lord seduced her and tried to feed on her, but she pressed a crucifix to his forehead, searing his flesh and forcing him to recoil. She fled, but Dracula pursued her in bat form. The police refused to believe her story, so she came to Blade for help. Determined to hunt Dracula down, Blade donned his gear and went into the night. Dracula attacked him from the skies, knocking him into the street as a speeding car narrowly missed him. Meanwhile, in India, Taj Natal visited his wheelchair-bound wife, who greeted him with joy, only for Taj to strike her silently across the face and leave without a word. Back in London, Blade and Dracula clashed through the city, their violent fight tearing through a sporting goods store. Blade wounded Dracula with a broken ski pole and then a wooden dagger, forcing the vampire to retreat. Scotland Yard allowed Blade to leave, and he returned home to Saffron and Trudy, promising explanations in the morning. At Castle Dunwick, Dracula bids Sheila Whittier goodnight before retreating to his coffin. Outside Harker's estate, Frank Drake told Rachel he needed to find his purpose, and left after sharing one last kiss. Chapter 25. Night of the Bloodstalker. In London, a woman named Adrienne Brown Walters visited the office of private investigator Hannibal King, desperate for help solving her husband Fred Walters' murder. She explained that she had witnessed a man bite Fred across the throat before vanishing without a trace. King immediately recognized the signs of a vampire attack, but concealed his knowledge, agreeing to investigate. His search led him to the Lucky Inn, a seedy bar connected to the victim. When King began asking questions, the bartender lured him into a back room and suddenly attacked. King overpowered the man with ease and, upon closer inspection, discovered twin puncture wounds on his neck, clear evidence that the bartender was enthralled by a vampire. King traced Fred's connections to Wyandanch Limited, an international shipping company where he had worked as an accountant. Suspecting something sinister behind the firm's shipping records, King infiltrated the dockside office late at night. There he overheard Dracula himself conferring with one of his human agents, O'Brien. When Dracula noticed King, he attacked. King fired his gun, but the bullet passed through Dracula's intangible form and struck O'Brien instead. Dracula hurled King through a second-story window and disappeared into the night. Undeterred, King returned, interrogating the wounded O'Brien. He learned that a coffin had recently been shipped to a warehouse in Kensington. Following this lead, King stormed the location and discovered Dracula surrounded by several vampire minions. A fierce battle broke out. King destroyed most of the vampires before police sirens forced Dracula to retreat. The next evening, King met Adrienne again to share his findings. He revealed that her husband's murder was tied to Dracula's efforts to conceal shipping records linked to the transportation of his coffins across Europe. Adrienne thanked him and left, unaware of the deepest truth. Hannibal King's knowledge of vampires came from experience. He himself was one of the undead. Chapter 26. Where Lurks the Chimera. Pawn shop owner Joshua Eshkol finally completed assembling the mystical statue known as the Chimera, a legendary relic said to embody nightmare itself. His son David grew worried about the power it might unleash, warning his father of the danger. Before they could continue their debate, armed intruders broke into the shop and filled the room with gas. When the fumes cleared, David found his father dead, still clutching the statue's broken tail and the final fragment that the thieves had failed to steal. Meanwhile, in India, Taj Natal, unpacked his belongings in a small rented room when his old friend Ramon visited. Ramon pleaded with Taj to forgive his paralyzed wife for the tragic accident that cost Taj both his voice and his son's life. Overcome with grief, Taj struck Ramon repeatedly while his friend endured the blows, begging him to reconcile with his wife. In London, Dracula walked the foggy streets and was confronted by a gang of muggers. With a mere gaze, he hypnotized them into murdering each other, then took flight toward his true destination, the pawnshop of Joshua Eshkol. Upon arrival, Dracula found the place swarming with police and Joshua dead. Seeing young David clutching the statue's tail, he decided to follow the boy, sensing its importance. David soon encountered Sheila Whittier, Dracula's familiar, posing as a museum curator concerned about his father's death. She subtly gained his trust and learned that the rest of the statue had been stolen by unknown thieves. Elsewhere, one of the culprits contacted his furious employer, who demanded the missing Chimera fragment be recovered at any cost. Far away, Frank Drake rekindled an old flame with Chastity Jones, before setting off with her to South America, seeking purpose and unknowingly heading toward new horrors. Meanwhile, David and Sheila visited Lydia, the elderly midwife who had known David's mother. Lydia explained that the Chimera originated in ancient Atlantis and granted its wielder the power of the Cosmic Eternal, bringing death to all who possessed it. Tracking the thieves, Dracula infiltrated their hideout, only to discover their leader was his old nemesis, Dr. Sons. Trapped as steel shutters sealed the room, Dracula watched in fury as holy water began flooding in from above. Chapter 27, Nightfire. Dracula, in pursuit of the 2 stolen fragments of the powerful Chimera statue, fell into a trap devised by his old nemesis, Dr. Sons. Trapped inside a sealed chamber where holy water poured steadily from the ceiling, Dracula found his only escape through the narrow vent from which the liquid fell. Transforming into a bat failed as the gap was too tight, so he shifted into mist form. Though he managed to escape, the holy water seared his body, leaving him horribly burned and unconscious by the roadside. Meanwhile, in Brazil, Frank Drake and Chastity Jones arrived to meet Frank's old associate, Danny, who invited him to become a partner in his new adventure, Summer Inc. Back in London, Rachel Van Helsing visited Quincy Harker, confiding her uncertainty about her relationship with Frank. Quincy advised her that Frank, having lost his fortune, needed to rediscover his independence. Rachel feared that change might affect how she felt about him, but hoped he would find his way. Elsewhere, one of Dr. Sons' subordinates delivered the Chimera's head, claiming the body and tail were missing. Sensing deceit, Dr. Sons triggered a trapdoor over a pit of acid to extract the truth. The terrified man confessed that he had hidden the missing piece in a safe deposit box. Dr. Sons killed him regardless and ordered his agent, Mei Li, to retrieve it. Meanwhile, Dr. Eshkol and Sheila Whittier, still searching for the missing Chimera parts, discovered Dracula lying wounded on the roadside. Reviving, he revealed his true identity and his plan to use the Chimera's power to dominate the world. Holding the statue's tail, Dracula summoned a fiery apparition of the Chimera, causing blazing rain to fall from the sky, even as far away as India, where Taj Natal narrowly survived his jeep plunging off a cliff. Dracula extinguished the flames and raised an army of vampires from Highgate Cemetery to recover the remaining fragments. Horrified, David fled, clutching his Star of David. When Dracula attacked, the holy symbol burned him back, until David's wavering faith weakened its power. Before Dracula could strike again, Dr. Sons' armed agents arrived, demanding their surrender. Chapter 28, Madness in the Mind. In India, Taj Natal finally returned to his home to confront the tragedy he had long avoided. His paralyzed wife brought him into an adjoining room, where Taj saw their son Audrey for the first time since the boy was turned into a vampire. She explained that she had been keeping Audrey alive through blood transfusions, but the villagers had begun demanding the child's death before he could endanger anyone. Unable to kill her only son, she begged Taj not to take him away, torn between love and horror. Meanwhile, in England, Dracula, Sheila Whittier, and David Eshkol awoke to find themselves prisoners of Dr. Sons. Having reassembled the Chimera, soon intended to wield its limitless cosmic power to dominate the universe. When Dracula tried to break free, Dr. Sons' agent Mei Li struck him across the face with a glowing cross, burning his flesh. To demonstrate his control, Dr. Sons began torturing them with psychic illusions born from the Chimera's energy. David was the first victim. Dr. Sons conjured a cruel doppelganger of David's father, Jacob, who mocked his son's faith and tore away his Star of David. condemning him to hell. The illusion shattered David's mind, and Mei Li pushed him down an elevator shaft. He awoke within another illusion, dressed in biblical garb and confronted by a burning bush that declared itself Satan before engulfing him in flames. Sheila next succumbed to her own fantasy. Dracula professed eternal love and redemption, but when she looked into his face, she saw only a grinning skeleton mocking her affection. Dracula's torment followed. Sun conjured the images of his enemies, Quincy Harker, Rachel Van Helsing, Blade, Frank Drake, Taj Natal, and Lilith. Realizing the deception when he saw Harker walking and Taj speaking, Dracula shattered the illusion by knocking the Chimera from its pedestal. Grabbing the relic, Dracula ignored Mei Li's threat to kill Sheila and hypnotically compelled her to stab herself. He fed on her guard before reclaiming the Chimera. Horrified, Sheila struck it from his grasp, smashing it to pieces. Declaring no one deserved such power, she renounced Dracula and left with David, as the vampire lord's desperate pleas went unanswered. Chapter 29. Vengeance is mine, saith the vampire. Raging across England, Dracula hunted for blood, attacking a young woman in the street. When bystanders tried to intervene, he slaughtered them all with ease before feeding on his victim. A police officer arrived and attempted to arrest him, but Dracula mocked the mortal's courage, transformed into a bat, and flew into the night. Returning to his mansion hideout, he brooded over Sheila Whittier's departure. Torn between anger and melancholy, disgusted by his moment of weakness, he vowed to deal harshly with humanity when darkness fell again. At David Eshkoll's home, Sheila confessed her fear that Dracula would come for revenge. David decided to confront the vampire himself, determined to end the threat once and for all. Ignoring Sheila's pleas, he armed himself with a wooden stake and his Star of David and set off for her old mansion, Dracula's current lair. Meanwhile, in India, Taj Natal wept beside his sedated vampire son, Audrey, whom his wife had kept alive through blood transfusions. She reflected on the day Dracula and his legion of vampires had descended on their village, leaving her crippled, Taj mutilated, and their child cursed. Rachel Van Helsing had arrived during the attack, saving them and forcing Dracula to flee, but the tragedy had driven Taj to leave India and join Van Helsing's crusade against the vampire lord. Back in England, David infiltrated Dracula's manor during daylight hours, hoping to strike as the vampire slept. But Dracula awoke from his coffin as David approached, instantly overpowering him. David's faith faltered, his Star of David losing its strength, and Dracula tore him apart with ease. Carrying David's lifeless body, Dracula flew to Sheila's home and threw it before her in triumph, proclaiming his dominance. Horrified and broken, Sheila refused to submit. Declaring she would rather die than live as Dracula's slave, she hurled herself from the window, her body shattering on the ground below. For once, shaken by his own actions, Dracula stood in shock before fleeing the scene, transforming into a bat and vanishing into the night sky. Chapter 30. Memories on a Morning's Night. At the cemetery, Dracula visited the grave of Sheila Whittier, speaking softly to her headstone and expressing genuine regret for her death. Leaving in bat form, he returned to his mansion and began recording in his journal, reflecting on times when he had allowed himself to be deceived by what he perceived as innocence. He recalled an event in 19th century Germany when a woman named Liza Strong summoned him to kill her husband, Archibald Strong. Lydia claimed Archibald's hunger for power would destroy both her and Dracula, promising to share her life and power with him if he aided her. She warned that Archibald sought to overthrow Otto von Bismarck and conquer Romania, including Dracula's castle. Accepting the task, Dracula found Archibald arguing with Bismarck. However, Liza betrayed him. She arrived with soldiers who staked Dracula and dumped him in a river. She had secretly been Bismarck's lover and plotted Archibald's death to help Bismarck rise to power. Yet Bismarck spurned her, exiling her instead. Alone in the woods, she fell victim to Dracula's revenge and became a vampire before later being slain by Abraham Van Helsing. Dracula mused on how Bismarck's ascent eventually led to war and Romania's invasion, then turned his mind to a more recent encounter. He remembered meeting Melanie Knight, a blind child whose impoverished parents, Paul and Marcia, argued violently over money. When Paul shot and killed Marcia, Dracula entered the home, slew Paul in retaliation, and told Melanie he had avenged her. But the child, horrified, struck him and cried that she hated him, an emotion the vampire could not comprehend. Finally, Dracula recalled his first meeting with Blade in China in 1968. Blade had lured him with a false alliance claiming to represent humans ready to serve vampires. Taken to meet Blade's allies, Ogun, Azu, Musenda, and Orji, Dracula realized it was a trap. The hunters staked him, but his servants rescued him before death. When the hunters returned, Dracula slaughtered all but Blade. Writing in his journal, Dracula reflected that only Blade still lived, while he, eternal, endured forever. Chapter 31. 10 Lords A-Dying. Dracula began a new campaign of terror in London, targeting influential members of Parliament. His first victim was Mary Beth Singleton, the 19-year-old daughter of Lord Arthur Singleton. Leaving her body as a message, Dracula warned Singleton to obey his commands or face ruin. Scotland Yard assigned the case to Inspector Chelm, who immediately suspected a vampire was responsible. Consulting with veteran hunter Quincy Harker, Chelm presented a list of recent vampire-related deaths. Harker, analyzing the evidence, became certain that Dracula had returned to England. Meanwhile, in India, Taj Natal stood over his vampiric son Audrey, stake in hand, torn between duty and fatherhood. Though he tried to summon the will to end Audrey's cursed existence, Taj faltered. His wife wept with relief, unable to lose their child. But their moment of reprieve ended as angry villagers stormed their home, demanding permission to destroy the young vampire themselves. Far away in Brazil, Frank Drake arrived at an archaeological dig site with his old friend Danny Summers, who had hired him to manage the idle workers. As Frank contemplated his new start, his mind wandered to Rachel Van Helsing. Back in London, Rachel relaxed at home but sensed an unexplained draft in her room, an omen she had no time to address. That night, atop Big Ben, Dracula brooded over his defiance from Lord Singleton. Having already issued 2 warnings, he decided to make an example of the politician. Using 10 enthralled members of Parliament, he sent them to intimidate Singleton. However, Chelm and his officers anticipated the strike, capturing the hypnotized officials. When the police left, Dracula descended upon Singleton himself. Singleton stood defiant, revealing he had information capable of destroying the vampire lord. Dracula ripped apart the documents only to learn that multiple copies existed. Attempting hypnosis, he discovered Singleton had been trained by Quincy Harker to resist. Enraged, Dracula prepared to turn him into a vampire, but Chelm's men burst in, shooting Dracula with a silver bullet. Over the radio, Harker's voice cut through, declaring he possessed the files that could end Dracula's existence, and ordering Chelm to finish him. Laughing at his old foe's audacity, Dracula shattered the window, transformed into a bat, and flew into the night, intent on confronting Quincy Harker himself. Chapter 32. And some call him Madness. Quincy Harker prepared for the inevitable confrontation, confident that his traps and knowledge would finally destroy Dracula. Sitting in his fortified mansion with his loyal dog Saint, he waited patiently. When the phone rang, Quincy expected Rachel Van Helsing, but instead, it was Dracula. The vampire lord mockingly informed him that he would arrive soon to kill him personally. In India, Taj Natal's tragedy deepened. The villagers, terrified of the vampire child Audrey, stormed Taj's home despite his pleas. Helpless to stop them, Taj watched in anguish as they drove a stake through his son's heart, ending the cursed life Dracula had inflicted years earlier. Meanwhile, in Brazil, Frank Drake tried to motivate Danny Summers' workers at the excavation site, only to realize they were actually zombies. The undead laborers turned on him, forcing Frank to fight for survival with only a pistol. Back at his villa, Danny called Dracula in London, reporting that Frank Drake had been taken care of. When his enemies seemingly scattered, Dracula took flight toward Quincy Harker's estate. Upon arrival, he mocked Quincy's setup, a chair rigged with hidden stakes, and demanded a real challenge. Harker unleashed Saint, whose collar was embedded with silver crosses. The dog lunged, burning Dracula's flesh before being knocked aside. Quincy used the moment to escape deeper into his mansion, forcing Dracula to follow through a gauntlet of traps. The vampire was struck by a wooden spear, singed by garlic gas, and even hit with darts fired from Harker's weaponized wheelchair. Weakening but relentless, Dracula transformed into mist and pursued Harker into his study. He knocked away Harker's glasses, exploiting the old man's light-sensitive eyes. But Quincy triggered his final trap, a mechanism that launched multiple wooden spears into Dracula's chest. As Dracula withered in agony, Quincy cursed him for decades of torment and for murdering his wife and daughter. But before he could finish the job, the phone rang again. Rachel's voice came through. She was under attack by 2 female vampires, but urged him to kill Dracula regardless. One of the attackers seized the phone and issued an ultimatum to Quincy: free their master or Rachel Van Helsing would die. Chapter 33. Blood on My Hands. Quincy Harker stood over the dying Dracula, a wooden arrow buried in the vampire's heart. Yet his victory was interrupted when two of Dracula's female vampires called from outside, threatening to kill Rachel Van Helsing unless Quincy released their master. Torn, Quincy hesitated, remembering a painful night in 1955 when he buried his wife Elizabeth. His young daughter Edith had begged him then to promise she would never become a vampire, a vow that had haunted him ever since. Quincy recounted to Dracula an even earlier memory from 1945, when the vampire lord had attacked him and Elizabeth during a theater performance. Dracula had thrown Quincy from a balcony, crippling him, and taken Elizabeth. The police found her 2 days later, half drained of blood. Though she survived, she was never the same and ultimately took her own life 4 years after Edith's birth. Quincy explained that while he swore to destroy Dracula, he could not let Rachel die for it. With resignation, he removed the arrow, reviving Dracula. Freed, Dracula ordered his servants to release Rachel. Furious that Quincy had spared her at the cost of destroying Dracula, she stormed off. Dracula demanded to know how Harker planned his death, but Quincy told him only that Dracula's power was fading. Someone was stealing it, and that he had 2 weeks left to live. Dismissing the claim, Dracula vowed to return in 3 weeks to kill Quincy. As a final insult, he shattered the urn containing Edith's ashes before departing. In India, Taj Natal and his wife mourned their slain son Audrey and decided to remain together, hoping for peace. In London, Dracula reflected on his weakening powers, realizing that others, Gorna, Hannibal King, and Lord Henry, had resisted his will. Concluding that Dr. Sun must be draining his strength since their last encounter, he resolved to find and destroy him. Meanwhile, Quincy prepared his will, convinced death was near. That night, a drunk named Snitcher told tales of a vampire murder in a London pub, only to be silenced permanently by a real vampire. Elsewhere, Dracula, now hunting Dr. Sons, commanded his servant Bennington to steal files from Lord Singleton. As Bennington killed a guard and delivered the stolen documents, Inspector Chelm secretly closed in, armed with cross-engraved silver bullets and ready to strike. Chapter 34. Showdown of Blood. In the jungles of Brazil, Frank Drake found himself surrounded by a horde of zombies unleashed by Dracula's machinations. Armed only with a gun, Frank fought desperately, but his bullets proved useless against the undead. The creatures overpowered him and nearly hurled him off a cliff before Brother Voodoo appeared. Channeling his deceased brother Daniel's spirit, Voodoo temporarily possessed Frank's body, allowing him to escape the zombies' grasp. Though rescued, Frank remained cornered, and Brother Voodoo swore to destroy the horde before they could claim another victim. Meanwhile, in London, Dracula met with his servant Bennington, who delivered the stolen government file containing details about him. Unbeknownst to them, Inspector Chelm had tracked the exchange. Taking aim with a revolver loaded with cross-engraved silver bullets, Chelm fired, but Dracula dodged by pulling Bennington in front of him, killing the servant instead. The vampire lord lunged at Chelm, intent on feeding, unaware that another vampire secretly observed from the shadows, plotting to exploit Dracula for his own gain. As backup officers arrived, one struck Dracula with a rifle butt, but before they could fire again, Dracula dissolved into mist and escaped into the night. In Jajpur, India, Taj Natal decided to end his crusade and remain with his wife following the death of their son. He penned a letter to Rachel Van Helsing, bidding farewell and explaining that he would not rejoin her fight against Dracula. At Scotland Yard, Inspector Chelm convened with Quincy Harker and psychologist Dr. Scott to predict Dracula's next move. Scott suggested that the vampire might flee London, fearing death despite his past resurrections. Rachel soon joined them, revealing what she had overheard. Dracula's powers were waning, and he feared Dr. Sons was draining his strength. Chelm resolved to investigate operations, also noting that the vampire hunter Blade was now wanted for murder. Elsewhere, struggling fashion designer Daphne von Wilkinson argued with her staff, fired a designer, and raged against men she blamed for her failures. When a debt collector arrived, she dismissed him, only for Dracula to crash through her office window and collapse. Seeing him clutching the Dr. Sons file, Daphne read it, grasped its importance, and decided to use the vampire to her advantage. Calling the collector back, she lured him close, then let Dracula feed, marking the beginning of her revenge against men who wronged her. Chapter 35. Hell Hath No Fury. After reviving the weakened Dracula by letting him feed on Jackson Hardy, fashion designer Daphne von Wilkinson struck a bargain with the vampire lord. She promised to gather information on Dr. Sun if Dracula would kill 4 men she blamed for the collapse of her career. Using blackmail against a Scotland Yard contact, Daphne secured intelligence on her targets. She explained to Dracula that the men, Martin Beetering, Ken Mitchell, Jack Bolt, and Winston Twindle, had stolen her fashion designs and ruined her reputation, because no one believed a woman could have been wronged. Amused by her thirst for vengeance, Dracula agreed to fulfill her request, demanding multiple victims to sustain his hunger. Meanwhile, in Brazil, Frank Drake and Brother Voodoo battled the zombies that had nearly killed Frank. Using Voodoo's spiritual powers and Daniel's ghostly aid, the 2 men overcame the undead horde, burning the last of them alive. With the fight won, Voodoo urged Frank to help him find Danny Summers, the man who had betrayed Frank and lured them into the deadly trap. Back in London, Dracula made his first stop at the home of Martin Beetering, who argued bitterly with his wife over their financial downfall. When Dracula appeared at their door, claiming Daphne had sent him, Martin was intrigued until Dracula sank his fangs into him, then turned on Tilly as well. Returning to Daphne's studio, Dracula was rewarded with one of her models, Angie, as another meal. He told Daphne the remaining 3 men would die within days. The next night, Dracula seduced Ken Mitchell into a private meeting, only to drain him in a restroom. Soon after, he killed Jack Bolt, mocking him for dismissing Daphne's talent. His final victim, Winston Twindle, was slain mid-drive through Scotland, Dracula appearing in his car, feeding and sending the vehicle plunging off a cliff. 3 nights later, Dracula returned. Daphne proudly declared that she'd learned from police contact that Dr. Sun was operating out of Boston. Pleased, Dracula confirmed all her enemies were dead, but in a cruel twist, he proved it by summoning their newly turned vampire corpses to devour her alive. Chapter 36. Blight of Fear. Quincy Harker, Rachel Van Helsing, and Inspector Chelm assembled at Dr. Scott's request to listen to a series of recorded eyewitness accounts detailing Dracula's latest movements. The first recording featured William Perry, an airport worker at London Heathrow, who described how a flight bound for Boston was delayed after mechanical issues were found in the landing gear. The delay enraged Dracula, who demanded an immediate seat on another plane. When told every flight was full, he attacked the ticket agent, killing and feeding on an airport staff member before escaping in mist form, leaving chaos behind. Dr. Scott paused the tape, prompting Rachel to question the purpose of hearing such testimonies. Scott explained that the recordings proved insight into Dracula's unstable mindset and could help predict his next moves. He then played the second tape, a report from U.S. Air Force Captain Sid Greenlee. Stationed in the UK, Greenlee had been ordered to fly a test mission to Washington, D.C. to evaluate new onboard camera technology. Unbeknownst to him, Dracula boarded the jet in mist form and revealed himself mid-flight, demanding the pilot divert to Boston. When Greenlee refused, Dracula allowed him to be photographed to prove his power, but the developed image revealed nothing, confirming his supernatural nature. The added weight of the vampire caused the jet's systems to malfunction, triggering its own missile locks. Greenlee barely maneuvered the jet to safety, noticing that Dracula reacted to the missile guidance signals with visible pain. Upon landing in Boston, soldiers attempted to apprehend the vampire, but Dracula shrugged off the bullets and transformed into a bat to escape. Dr. Scott continued, explaining that afterward Dracula had been seen weakened, accepting a ride from a cab driver and unsuccessfully trying to feed on a girl. Quincy halted further playback, concluding it was time to pursue Dracula to America. Meanwhile, in Brazil, Frank Drake and Brother Voodoo located Danny Summers' hut and found Chastity Jones inside. When Danny tried to steal their Jeep, Frank stopped him and learned that Dracula had forced Danny to send zombies after him. Frank reluctantly spared him and departed, with Brother Voodoo warning he hadn't joined this fight just to walk away. Back in London, Quincy and Rachel boarded a plane bound for Boston. After seeing them off, Dr. Scott made a secret phone call, reporting everything directly to his master, Dr. Sun. Chapter 37. The Vampire's Coming! The Vampire is coming! In Boston, a weakened Dracula wandered the streets, drawing uneasy stares from pedestrians. Though his power had been greatly diminished by Dr. Sun's interference, his strength still far exceeded that of ordinary humans. When one man stared too long, Dracula snapped, grabbing him violently and draining his blood in fury before disappearing into the night. Across the city, hacker horror writer Harold H. Harold sat paralyzed by writer's block. Once a rising pulp author, he hadn't produced a vampire story in 3 years. Desperate, he visited the offices of True Vampire Stories to meet his frustrated editor, Mr. Greedley. When Greedley demanded new material, Harold blurted out a lie that he had arranged an interview with a real vampire. The claim briefly appeased his editor, but as Harold left, the weight of his false promise sank in. He had no vampire, no story, and no idea what to do next. Meanwhile, in a hidden chamber beneath Boston, Dr. Soon prepared for Dracula's arrival. His cyborg servant, Juno, entered through a concealed passageway to receive his orders. The disembodied voice of Sun demanded readiness for battle. Juno, demonstrating his augmented power, unsheathed a blade built into his forearm and cleaved it through a stone wall, vowing that he was fully prepared to confront the vampire lord. Elsewhere, Dracula, still starving for blood, ambushed 2 cyclists on a dark road. He fed on them but remained frail, collapsing beside the wreckage of their burning motorcycle. Moments later, Harold H. Harold happened to drive by. Believing Dracula to be an injured man, Harold loaded him into his car and took him to his apartment. Only when the vampire began to stir did Harold realize who he truly was. Panicking, he phoned Greedley's secretary, Aurora Rabinowitz, asking her to come immediately. Before she could arrive, Dracula began to rise from Harold's couch, his hunger and fury awakening. Meanwhile, in Brazil, Brother Voodoo ended his alliance with Frank Drake, assuring him he was now capable of combating undead threats alone. Using mystic fog, Voodoo teleported Frank back to the US, where he reunited with Quincy Harker and Rachel Van Helsing at the airport. Chapter 38, Blood Rush. Harold H. Harold anxiously waited for Aurora Rabinowitz to arrive, eager to prove that the pale, unconscious man in his apartment was indeed a real vampire. To his shock, Dracula briefly rose from bed before collapsing again. When Aurora arrived, she helped Harold carry the vampire lord back to the bed. Skeptical at first, Aurora began to believe when Dracula weakly muttered about his desperate need for blood. Panicked over where to find any, Aurora recalled that Harvard's medical labs stored blood supplies, knowledge she gained from a past relationship with a football player there. Meanwhile, deep within his hidden base, Dr. Soon monitored Quincy Harker, Rachel Van Helsing, and Frank Drake through surveillance feeds. His cyborg enforcer Juno prepared for combat as they discussed plans to destroy Dracula. Frank momentarily thought he saw the vampire outside, prompting the group to give chase. However, they were lured by one of Soon's illusions, leading them straight into his trap. Captured, they were brought before Soon. He revealed his latest scheme. He had once attempted to transfer Dracula's memories into another vampire, but had also managed to siphon portions of Dracula's power for himself. Now, he intended to harness the full extent of that vampiric strength to conquer the world. Quincy scoffed, warning that a planet of vampires would be unsustainable, since they would consume all human prey. Attempting to strike, Quincy fired darts from his wheelchair, destroying the machine draining Dracula's power. Soon, enraged, ordered Juno to capture Dracula. At Harold's apartment, Dracula rapidly regained strength now that the siphoning had ceased. He thanked Harold and Aurora for their aid and, surprisingly, spared their lives. When Harold begged for an interview to save his career, Dracula, amused, agreed. But before he could begin, Juno burst through the door to apprehend him. Recognizing this as his chance to confront Soon, Dracula willingly went along. Determined to follow, Aurora convinced Harold they should trail them to save Dracula. Soon after, Juno delivered Dracula to Soon's library, where Quincy, Rachel, and Frank were held prisoner. Dr. Soon greeted the revived vampire lord and declared his intent to destroy him once and for all. Chapter 39, The Death of Dracula. Dr. Soon held Quincy Harker, Rachel Van Helsing, and Frank Drake captive in his underground fortress, waiting for his enforcer Juno to bring Dracula for a final confrontation. Confident in his plan, Soon declared that he would destroy Dracula and claim his power to become the new king of vampires. Nearby, Harold H. Harold and Aurora Rabinowitz followed a trail that led them straight to Soon's hidden lair, determined to help Dracula. Inside, Juno prepared for battle. His combat suit was outfitted with deadly modifications, silver-tipped boots, and a large silver stake in place of his left hand. When Dracula arrived, the two clashed violently. Juno struck first, slashing Dracula's arm and drawing blood. Despite his weakened condition, Dracula fought with fury, but Juno's enhanced strength and precision kept him on the defensive. The silver wounds burned, leaving Dracula reeling. Drawing on his centuries of experience, Dracula eventually overpowered the cyborg warrior, smashing him to the ground in a brief but brutal reversal. Just as he prepared to finish Juno, Harold and Aurora burst into the chamber. Their interruption proved disastrous. Dracula hesitated for a moment, distracted by their sudden entrance. Seizing the opportunity, Juno drove his silver-tipped arm straight into Dracula's heart. The vampire lord screamed as his flesh withered, collapsing into a pile of bones and dust. Aurora and Harold frantically tried to remove the stake, but Juno struck them down and ignited a flamethrower, burning Dracula's remains to ash. With his enemy annihilated, Dr. Soon ordered Juno to imprison the survivors and place Dracula's ashes into an urn while he prepared for world domination. In their cell, Aurora wept, confessing her love for Dracula, though Rachel insisted it was merely his hypnotic influence. The group resolved to stop Dr. Soon before his power grew further. Using Rachel's crucifix-shaped barrette as a lockpick, they escaped, fought past Soon's guards, and fled in Harold's car. Watching remotely, Dr. Soon revealed their escape was expected. He anticipated Harker would seek help from the US military and planned to use his growing hypnotic abilities to enslave the soldiers when they arrived. Chapter 40. Nightmares of a Living Dead Man. Aurora Rabinowitz awoke in terror from a vivid nightmare of Dracula's death at the hands of Juno, screaming loud enough to summon Harold H. Harold, Frank Drake, and Rachel Van Helsing to her room. Once it became clear she had only been dreaming, the men were dismissed and Rachel stayed behind to speak with her. Rachel shared her own painful experience, recalling how, on her 16th birthday, Dracula had tried to seduce her and she had almost succumbed to his will, only to be saved at the last moment by Quincy Harker. She explained that her attraction to Dracula then was purely the result of his hypnotic power over women. Aurora, however, insisted that her affection for Dracula was genuine, claiming she had never been under his control. The next morning, the group met with General Coder at a military base. Though hesitant to authorize military intervention in Boston, Coder revealed that he had been ordered to deploy troops to destroy Dr. Soon's stronghold. Unbeknownst to the general, Dr. Soon himself had manipulated these orders, intending to use his growing hypnotic powers to enslave the very soldiers sent against him. As the army approached Soon's headquarters, the villain activated an ultrasonic frequency that instantly placed the troops under his control. The only ones unaffected were Quincy, Rachel, Frank, Harold, and Aurora, who fought through the entranced soldiers and managed to retreat. Regrouping at Harold's apartment, the shaken team realized that even with Dracula gone, Dr. Soon posed a far greater threat, and that no human force could stop him. In desperation, they decided the unthinkable: resurrect Dracula using his ashes. Frank and Rachel led the infiltration into Soon's base, forcing Harold, despite his fear, to accompany them. Inside, they fought their way past guards, and Rachel killed Juno with a well-aimed arrow. Harold clumsily retrieved Dracula's urn, and the group escaped before Dr. Soon could intervene. Back at the apartment, the vampire hunters gathered around the urn containing Dracula's ashes, fully aware of what they were about to do. To save humanity, they would have to bring Dracula back from the dead. Chapter 41. Rebirth. Desperate to stop the greater evil of Dr. Soon, Quincy Harker, Rachel Van Helsing, Frank Drake, Aurora Rabinowitz, and Harold H. Harold searched Harold's vast library of vampire lore for a method to resurrect Dracula. Despite hours of effort, nothing worked until Aurora's tears fell onto Dracula's ashes. To everyone's astonishment, the vampire lord was instantly restored to full life and strength. Now standing before his mortal enemies, Dracula listened as they explained that they had revived him to destroy Dr. Soon. Amused, he agreed but declared he needed to feed first. When Harold offered stored blood, Dracula scoffed, preferring to claim a living victim. Taking bat form, he departed, warning that an innocent girl's life would be the price for saving the world. He soon found a young woman and fed on her, but before finishing, he was confronted by Blade, who had tracked Dracula to Boston to avenge his mother's death. Despite Blade's ferocity, Dracula easily overpowered him and compelled him to return to Harold's apartment. There, the hunters briefed Blade on their plan and explained why they had brought Dracula back. Blade accused them of madness, insisting Dracula was pure evil. He also revealed that he had been framed for several murders by a vampire coven acting independently of Dracula. When Aurora defended the vampire, Blade warned her that Dracula would kill her without hesitation. Declaring he wanted no part in their crusade, Blade stormed out, though secretly he decided to shadow Dracula's movements. Once informed of Juno's death, Dracula left to confront Dr. Soon himself. Detecting his approach, Soon unleashed the hypnotized soldiers guarding his fortress. Dracula tore through them with ease, even forcing one to turn his weapon on himself. Reaching Soon's control chamber, Dracula barely dodged a mental energy blast. As he prepared to strike, Blade appeared from the shadows, announcing that, for now, he would help Dracula destroy Dr. Soon. Chapter 42. A final battle waged. Dracula and Blade formed an uneasy alliance to destroy Dr. Soon, who had stolen Dracula's hypnotic powers and taken control of an entire military unit. Together they stormed Soon's heavily guarded fortress, cutting through waves of entranced soldiers. As they battled their way deeper inside, neither realized that the vampire responsible for killing Blade's mother was secretly observing their fight from the shadows. During the chaos, Dr. Soon triggered a trap beneath Blade, opening a deep pit lined with metal spikes. Blade caught himself between the walls, halting his fall but shredding his palms against the concrete. Bloodied and slipping, he struggled to pull himself free, while Dracula continued forward towards Soon's chamber. Meanwhile, at Harold H. Harold's apartment, Frank Drake grew restless, waiting for news. He insisted they take action, convincing Rachel, Aurora, and even the reluctant Harold to join him, while Quincy Harker remained behind. In the pit, Blade braced his legs and climbed out, only to be ambushed by Soon's hypnotized soldiers. As he fought them, he caught sight of the vampire who had murdered his mother, but before he could act, a soldier struck him unconscious with a rifle butt. Inside the control room, Dr. Soon launched his psychic assault on Dracula, bombarding him with mental bolts and forcing him toward mist form. Dracula resisted, calling upon the dark gods for strength. Soon then attacked with radiant cross-shaped light beams, but Dracula fought through the pain and advanced, overpowering Soon and reclaiming the vampiric powers stolen from him. Blade regained consciousness to see the soldiers freed from Soon's influence and the mysterious vampire gone. Frank and the others arrived just as Soon's machines exploded, exposing his brain on the floor. Dracula appeared, fully restored, and saved Harold from a fatal mind bolt that rebounded and destroyed Soon's apparatus, engulfing the brain in flames. As the fire subsided, Rachel questioned who Soon truly was and what his motives had been. Before anyone could answer, Blade confronted Dracula, demanding his help to find the vampire who murdered his mother or face his wrath instead. Chapter 43. Paul Butterworth, the Nightstalker. Paul Butterworth, a reporter for the Boston Bugle, frantically typed up his story, knowing Dracula was coming for him. His account began on New Year's Eve when Maryanne Travers was attacked and drained of blood by Dracula while walking home from a party. Paul arrived at the crime scene seeking a scoop but was quickly dismissed by the police. Later that same night, Margaret Simmons visited her husband's grave and witnessed Dracula rise from the earth, only to be his next victim. When Paul heard these strange reports, he began to suspect the vampires were involved. A radio ad for Harold H. Harold's True Vampire Stories, an eyewitness account of Harold's supposed encounters with Dracula, gave him a lead. Paul visited Harold's apartment, asking for an interview. Harold retold the aftermath of the battle with Dr. Soon, claiming that Blade had demanded Dracula's help finding the vampire who killed his mother, which led to a fight that Harold heroically ended. Paul saw through Harold's embellishments but got Blade's address and continued his investigation. On his way, Paul overheard a police radio reporting an attack by Dracula. Rushing to the scene, he arrived just in time to photograph the vampire in action, but slipped on ice as Dracula lunged at him. His crucifix came loose, repelling the vampire, who fled into the night. Paul finally reached Blade's location, finding him with Rachel Van Helsing, Frank Drake, and Quincy Harker. Blade gave Paul a truthful version of events, how Rachel's arrow had driven Dracula away during his fight with Blade. Meanwhile, downstairs, Dracula demanded Harker's room key from the hotel clerk. Moments later, he burst into the hunter's suite, overpowering Blade and nearly feeding on Rachel, before Paul confronted him with a crucifix. Enraged, Dracula hypnotized Paul and escaped. Back in the newsroom, Dracula attacked again. Paul fired silver bullets and wielded a sharpened crucifix, but Dracula overpowered him, until Paul pulled open the curtains, revealing the dawn. Hissing in pain, Dracula fled. When Paul's editor arrived, Paul rushed to develop his photos, only to discover that Dracula's image hadn't appeared, proving vampires could not be photographed. Lacking proof, he was demoted to writing the Ask Miss Annie advice column. Chapter 44. His name is Dr. Strange. Dr. Stephen Strange, searching for his missing aide Wong, used the Orb of Agamotto to locate him. Transporting Wong back to the Sanctum Sanctorium, Strange discovered 2 puncture wounds on his neck, signs of a vampire bite. To prevent Wong's transformation, Strange froze him in time and sent his astral form into Wong's mind to witness what had happened. He saw Wong responding to a woman's scream in the streets, only to find Dracula feeding on her. When the vampire realized he'd been seen, he turned on Wong and bit him. Emerging from the vision, Strange vowed to destroy Dracula and avenge his servant. Meanwhile, in Boston, Harold H. Harold visited Midnight Publishing to speak with Aurora Rabinowitz. He found her on the phone and was stunned to learn she had already turned her experience with Dracula into a book titled I Loved a Vampire. Envious and flustered, Harold confronted her about ignoring his invitations for another date. Aurora gently rejected him, calling him a sweet nerd, before answering another call that ended the awkward exchange. Elsewhere, Dracula returned to his current base, the ruins of Dr. Soon's headquarters, unaware that he was being shadowed by his rival, Deacon Frost. Enraged by past defeats, Dracula vented his anger on Soon's remaining machinery before retreating to his coffin to rest. At the same time, Blade continued his relentless pursuit of the vampire who had murdered his mother, staking out a nearby apartment to ambush his target. Back in New York, Dr. Strange traced Dracula's movements using the Eye of Agamotto and followed the trail to Boston. Upon entering the vampire's lair, Strange immediately attacked with powerful mystic energy. Dracula retaliated, breaking free of the crimson bands of Cyttorak and turning to mist. Strange used the images of Akon to expose Dracula's deepest fear, his death and rebirth as a vampire. When Strange demanded Dracula's help to save Wong, the vampire refused. Overpowering the weakened sorcerer, Dracula hypnotized Strange and prepared to feed. Meanwhile, Blade stormed his target's apartment, only to find not his mother's killer, but the vampire detective Hannibal King. Crossover: The Tomb of Dr. Strange. Dracula fed upon Dr. Strange and threw his body into the dungeon beneath Dr. Soon's old base, amused by the thought that the sorcerer would rise as his vampire thrall. But Strange had not been hypnotized as Dracula believed. He had projected his astral form before the attack. Now trapped outside his own body, he realized he had only 3 days before becoming a vampire himself and began devising a way to save his soul. Meanwhile, Dracula roamed the streets of Boston, his hunger growing. He came upon a ruined church that seemed to beckon him. Inside, a homeless woman begged him not to drive her away. Instead, Dracula fed upon her, but as he did, the spectral form of Dr. Soon appeared, taunting him for his sins before vanishing. Enraged, Dracula returned to his lair, searching for the cause of the vision. Finding no sign of machinery, he checked Strange's body, convinced the sorcerer was dead. Furious and unsettled, he shouted into the darkness his defiance of death itself. 2 nights later, Dracula sought out Wong to claim him as his new servant. At the scene of the attack, he discovered Wong's body gone. Suddenly, the spirit of his wife Maria appeared, condemning him. Dracula struck at the apparition, alarming bystanders who saw only a madman flailing at the air. The spirit fled, transforming into the spectral image of Dr. Strange, revealing the deception. As dawn broke over the ocean, Dracula fled in bat form, narrowly escaping the rising sun to take refuge in an abandoned seaside house. On the 3rd night, Dracula returned to Dr. Soon's lair with a stake to destroy Strange's body, but Strange's soul re-entered his now vampiric body, reviving him. He fought back, seizing the stake and turning it on Dracula, though it shattered in the struggle. Summoning a mystical crucifix of pure light, Strange burned Dracula horribly until the vampire fell still. With the battle over, Strange called Wong to him and purged the vampiric taint from them both. Leaving Dracula's motionless body behind, the sorcerer and his faithful servant departed the lair and returned home. Chapter 45. Crossfire. Blade tracked the trail of Deacon Frost, the vampire who killed his mother, and found vampire detective Hannibal King. Recognizing King as undead, Blade attacked immediately, ignoring King's insistence that they both sought Frost. King overpowered him easily, pinning him down. Releasing Blade, King explained that Frost had turned him into a vampire and he intended to destroy his maker. Despite Blade's hostility, King proposed an alliance so they could both exact revenge. After another brief clash, King subdued Blade again and showed him Frost's latest victim. King then revealed that although he was a vampire, he had never fed on a living being or spread the curse. Reluctantly, Blade agreed to work with him. Meanwhile, at Dr. Soon's abandoned hideout, Dr. Strange had just cured himself and Wong of vampirism after defeating Dracula. Believing the vampire lord dead, they departed, but Dracula revived, having deceived Strange with hypnosis. Seeking to rebuild his power, he flew to a desecrated church, intending to create a new religion of followers. Inside, he found every relic removed except for a painting of Christ. When he tried to destroy it, an unseen force stopped him, filling him with fury. Dracula next visited Harold H. Harold, interrupting the writer as he worked on a new vampire story. Dracula demanded the name of the leader of Boston's Satanist sect. Terrified, Harold searched his files and gave the name Anton Lipesky, along with his address. On his way to find Lipesky, Dracula stopped to feed on an old woman who recognized him from 1903. Her calm defiance enraged him, and though tempted, he let her go. That night, in Cambridge, Lipesky led a satanic ritual, offering a woman named Domini to Satan as his bride. Dracula appeared, posing as Satan, and declared Domini would instead be his own bride. She accepted, and Dracula proclaimed their wedding would occur in 3 days. Elsewhere, Blade and Hannibal waited for Frost's latest victim to rise. Once revived, the new vampire revealed Frost had exhumed a coffin containing an exact duplicate of Blade, one he claimed would help him conquer the world. Chapter 46. Let Us Be Wed in Unholy Matrimony. In a desecrated Boston church, Anton Lipesky led a satanic wedding between Dracula, whom the cult mistook for Satan himself, and Domini, his most devoted follower, offered as the bride of Satan. As blood was exchanged to seal the union, a single tear fell from the remaining painting of Jesus Christ still hanging in the defiled chapel. Elsewhere at American Chemron Industries, employee Wyndham confronted his superior, Mr. Slammerkin, over the company's illegal dumping of toxic waste into Boston Harbor. Fearing exposure, Slammerkin shot Wyndham in cold blood and convinced his board to help dispose of the body in an acid-filled waste pipe. Believing the acid would dissolve the evidence, they watched as the body vanished, unaware that Wyndham's corpse was preserved, his face erased, and his body reanimated. Rising from the polluted waters, the faceless man was born, driven by vengeance against those who murdered him. Meanwhile, Blade and Hannibal King continued their uneasy alliance to track down Deacon Frost, the vampire who killed Blade's mother and turned King into a vampire. Armed with information from a vampirized gravedigger, they followed Frost's trail, trying to uncover how Frost planned to use a mysterious duplicate of Blade to conquer the world. Back at the church, Dracula declared to his followers that he would give them a son to worship, a child to be born on the 25th of December. Transforming partially into bat form, Dracula carried Domini into the night to consummate their union. As they vanished, Wyndham began his vengeance. He broke into the home of Jack, one of the Chemron conspirators, and killed him, absorbing Jack's eye into his own faceless visage. Next, he slew Fred Anderson at a health spa, taking his right eye, and later ambushed Eli Harris, stealing his mouth. Meanwhile, Dracula hunted for blood, targeting Jean, another Chemron conspirator who was visiting Slammerkin. Hypnotizing her, Dracula entered the home, but before he could feed, the faceless man appeared, killing Jean and confronting the vampire. Wyndham overpowered Dracula, hurled him out a window, then turned on Slammerkin, tearing out his heart before his own body began to melt. As the faceless man dissolved, Dracula watched, denied both his prey and his vengeance, seething with fury in the dark. Chapter 47. Birthright. Death. In the desecrated church now ruled by Dracula, Domini noticed her husband staring into the distance with a look of sorrow. When she asked what troubled him, Dracula spoke of his long existence, 5 centuries of unlife, recalling his mortal days, his second wife Maria, and his transformation into a vampire by the gypsy Leanda. Though centuries had passed, he admitted his ambitions remained unchanged: to conquer the world. With his alliance to Anton Lipesky's satanic sect and his marriage to Domini, he believed he was closer than ever to realizing that goal. Elsewhere, Blade and Hannibal King paused their hunt for Deacon Frost, so Blade could reunite with his lover, Saffron, newly arrived from London. Meanwhile, the bumbling Harold H. Harold finally succeeded in getting a date with Aurora Rabinowitz. Not all relationships fared as well. At a quiet park, Rachel Van Helsing confronted Frank Drake over his reckless behavior since returning to the vampire hunt. She accused him of losing his compassion and adopting a careless bravado. When Frank tried to change the subject by kissing her, Rachel pushed him away and told him not to return until he had changed his attitude. Back in the church, Lipesky began a dark ritual meant to ensure that Domini would bear Dracula's child. Cloaked followers chanted as the ceremony reached its peak. Suddenly, a man armed with a shotgun burst in, killing one of the cultists and taking his robe to disguise himself. As the ritual neared completion, he revealed himself and opened fire, killing several of Lupesky's disciples. Dracula seized the intruder and tore away his hood, revealing Domini's father. Shocked, Domini begged for his life, but Lupesky restrained her. Her father made a final prayer beneath the lone oil painting of Christ before Dracula killed him. In the aftermath, Domini forgave Dracula easily. Gazing at the painting, she smiled and told him to take her home. Dracula carried her back to the former lair of Dr. Sun, where he proudly declared that their child, his heir, would be born on December 25th. Chapter 48, A Song for Maryanne. In Dracula's church, a weary vampire named Maryanne arrived to beg for release from her cursed existence. Kneeling before Dracula and his wife Domini, she recounted her long tragic history, a life that had crossed paths with Dracula more than once. Her story began in 1875 when she was only 4 years old. Her father, Captain Cutlass, a ruthless pirate, attempted to rob a French vessel that unknowingly served as Dracula's transport ship. For his crime, Dracula killed and turned Cutlass into a vampire. Maryanne was spared, left an orphan to grow up with the memory of her father's transformation burned into her mind. Nearly 3 decades later, in 1903, Maryanne lived in Vienna, Italy. Her father was still undead, chained in her home, surviving only through the blood she stole for him. One night, as she returned with stolen bottles of blood, she crossed paths with Dracula once again. Unaware of who she was, Dracula chose her as his random victim. But when the bottles shattered at her feet, the sound startled him long enough for her imprisoned father to break free. A vicious battle followed. Cutlass was killed by Dracula, and seeing the girl's grief, the vampire lord chose to spare her, leaving her to mourn her father alone. Her third encounter came in 1926 in Rome. Now grown, Maryanne had married Count Marcos de la Triana. When the Count refused to ship coffins for Dracula's voyage to America, he earned the vampire's wrath. Dracula attacked the couple during a carriage ride, recognizing Maryanne before spitefully killing her husband. 3 days later, Marcos returned from the grave as a vampire and turned Maryanne into one as well. The two lived together for decades, feeding on stolen blood until Marcos was slain by Blight, the vampire hunter, only days earlier. Now bereft of love and purpose, Maryanne told Dracula she no longer wished to live. She handed him a wooden stake, asking her to end her eternal torment. Dracula listened quietly, then accepted the stake, ready to fulfill her final request. She finished her story by telling him that. Chapter 49, And with the word there shall come death. Anton Lipesky sought an audience with Dracula to discuss the cult's dwindling finances, expressing concern over their future. Dracula dismissed his worries, assuring him that through his influence over the wealthy, he would secure funding to keep their operations thriving. Once Dracula departed to visit his wife Domini, Lipesky secretly smiled, revealing his intent to betray and destroy the vampire lord. When Dracula arrived home to Domini, both were startled as a sudden mystical force teleported him away. He materialized in a lavish mansion belonging to a woman named Angie Turner. Gifted with the strange ability to bring fictional characters to life, Angie had already conjured beings like Frankenstein's monster, D'Artagnan, Tom Sawyer, and Injun Joe to live with her. Wanting to create her greatest fantasy, she attempted to summon Bram Stoker's Dracula, but instead she brought forth the real Count Dracula himself. Confused by his surroundings, Dracula quickly realized he had been pulled from reality and treated the woman's adoration with disdain. Meanwhile, across the city, Blight was locked in battle with his vampiric double created by Deacon Frost. During the fight, the two made physical contact and began to fuse into one being. Hannibal King rushed to intervene, but before he could help, the fusion completed. The vampire doppelganger took full control of their merged body and prepared to attack King. At the same time, Frank Drake and Harold H. Harold broke into Anton Lipesky's mansion to investigate Dracula's connection to the satanic cult. They spied on a dark ritual in process, but were discovered by Lipesky, who unleashed his followers upon them. Frank fought back fiercely, determined not to go down, while outside, Rachel Van Helsing, having secretly followed Frank to keep him safe, arrived at the mansion. Back in Angie Turner's fantasy realm, Dracula furiously rejected her obsession with Stoker's novel, declaring it a feeble distortion of his truth. When Angie tried to defend her beloved Dracula, he struck her aside, prompting her fictional creations to rise against him. Dracula easily overpowered them all, even after she summoned Robin Hood and Zorro to aid her. Finally realizing that the real Dracula was nothing like the romantic figure she adored, Angie hurled her copy of Bram Stoker's Dracula into the fire. The book's destruction caused the real Count to vanish in agony, instantly returning to his world and to Dominique's arms. In truth, Angie's mansion was an illusion of her fractured mind. Confined to a padded cell after the deaths of her husband and child, she now lived peacefully in her fantasy world, surrounded by the literary companions she had imagined into being. Chapter 50. Where Soars the Silver Surfer? Dracula stalked the night once more, feeding on a young woman before being interrupted by a furious mob intent on saving her. Though easily overpowering the attackers, he chose not to waste his strength on mortals and fled into the darkness. Meanwhile, Anton Lupesky gathered 4 of his fellow Satanists at his mansion. With Dominique now pregnant with Dracula's child, they conspired to eliminate the vampire lord, believing his usefulness had ended. Elsewhere, Hannibal King fought the vampiric doppelganger of Blade. The creature's savage attacks nearly overwhelmed him, but King countered with skill, stabbing the false Blade through the chest with a wooden dagger and sending him crashing through a window before escaping. On 3 Ridges, Lupesky's followers conducted a forbidden ritual to summon a cosmic champion powerful enough to destroy Dracula. Their spell reached the Silver Surfer, who was journeying across Earth after a failed attempt to find Shalabal in Latveria. Angered by humanity's hostility, he was preparing to retaliate when the cult's spell teleported him away. Disoriented and weakened, the Surfer was implanted with false memories, visions of Dracula's evil, and a command to destroy him. At Dracula's church, followers offered blood tributes while Dominique reassured her husband their unborn child would be strong. When Dracula asked how she knew, Dominique replied that the Word had told her, her gaze fixed on the lone oil painting of Christ that still hung in the desecrated chapel. Moments later, the Silver Surfer materialized through that very painting and attacked. Furious, Dracula fought back with supernatural ferocity. The two agreed to move their battle outside to spare Dominique harm. Though the Surfer wielded the power cosmic, Dracula's vampiric might, mist form, and army of rats overwhelmed him. Defeated, the Surfer retreated, vowing to return. Later, questioning the strange battle, the Surfer revisited the church, but was stopped by Dominique, whose calm goodness unsettled him. Seeing the reflection of the Christ painting in her eyes, he sensed truth in her words, that all will end well. Accepting this, the Surfer departed. When Dracula asked what he had seen, Dominique replied softly, "The future, and it was good." Chapter 51. The Wildest Party. Rachel Van Helsing arrived at Anton Lupesky's mansion to rescue Frank Dracula and Harold H. Harold from the satanic cult's captivity. As she fought through Lupesky's followers, Dracula appeared to investigate the commotion. Rachel fired an arrow that struck Dracula in the chest, but not deeply enough to kill him. Writhing in pain, Dracula allowed the vampire hunters to escape. Once they fled, Dracula ordered Lupesky to remove the arrow. Though reluctant, since doing so would expose Dracula as a vampire rather than the Satan he claimed to be, Lupesky complied, saving Dracula's life. Meanwhile, upon returning home, Rachel and Frank found Quincy Harker collapsed from a heart attack and rushed him to the hospital. Later that evening, Dracula and Dominique hosted an extravagant party, inviting the wealthy elite in an effort to expand their cult's influence. Using his hypnotic powers, Dracula enthralled the guests after a skeptical woman accused him of evil. As he mingled with the crowd, Dracula glimpsed a mysterious figure from his past and gave chase, but found nothing. Lupesky, watching carefully, noted the rare sight of fear in Dracula's eyes and realized this unknown presence could threaten the vampire lord. Elsewhere, Hannibal King was still locked in a deadly chase with the vampiric doppelganger of Blade. Their battle crashed violently into Dracula's party, shocking the guests. Among the attendees was Deacon Frost, observing the chaos with satisfaction as part of his ongoing scheme. Enraged at the intrusion, Dracula attacked the Fall Blade, stunned to discover that his old nemesis now appeared to be a vampire himself. As the fight spread through the mansion, Hannibal spotted Deacon Frost and pursued him, but Frost escaped by transforming into a bat. Upstairs, Lupeski confided to Domini that he knew Dracula was not Satan, but a vampire, and sought her aid to destroy him. Domini, visibly pregnant, refused and vowed her loyalty to Dracula. Downstairs, the battle reached its peak. After trading blows with wooden stakes fashioned from broken furniture, the Blade doppelganger drove one into Dracula's chest, but failed to kill him. Dracula retaliated, taunting his opponent's weakness, and impaled the false Blade through the heart, killing him instantly. Chapter 52, Demons in the Mind. After the death of the Blade doppelganger, Blade's friends believed the real Blade had perished as well. They buried the body in a nearby cemetery while Rachel Van Helsing comforted Blade's grieving girlfriend, Saffron. Hannibal King solemnly recounted to Harold how Blade had supposedly died in the battle. Once the mourners departed, Dracula arrived at the grave to mock his fallen foe. While standing over the burial site, Dracula again saw the mysterious golden-skinned being who had appeared at his recent party. Demanding to know the stranger's identity, Dracula received no reply. Disturbed, he reflected on their previous encounters, centuries ago when he ruled a Spanish province and sought to overthrow its king, only to retreat upon the golden being's appearance, and again in 1870 during his failed attempt to lead a vampire invasion of Vienna. Each time, the sight of this radiant figure had driven Dracula to inexplicable fear. Haunted by the memories, Dracula decided to distract himself among mortals. He hypnotized a theater attendant for entry to a film adaptation of Dracula, but the mockery of his legend and the stench of humanity enraged him. When a woman scolded him for rudeness, he killed her, sending the audience into a panic. The golden being appeared once more, confronting Dracula and revealing his true face, glowing eyes and skin of light. Declaring that higher powers had decreed Dracula's destruction, the being's brilliance hurled Dracula into the movie screen. Believing his foe to be an emissary of Satan, Dracula accepted the challenge, boasting that even hell feared him. Their violent battle spilled into a nearby carnival, where the Golden One sought to expose Dracula's evil before the public. Elsewhere, Hannibal King visited Saffron, hinting that he had an idea that might change everything. Back at the carnival, Dracula used hypnosis to turn the crowd against itself, forcing them into a deadly frenzy. Distracted by the chaos, the Golden Being was impaled through the back by a metal rod. As he died, he told Dracula he served not hell, but a higher divine power. His glowing spirit ascended, leading Dracula back to his church. Inside, Dracula found only Domini, and the oil painting of Christ, its eyes shining with the same blinding light. Dracula screamed in fury and disbelief. Chapter 53, The Final Glory of Deacon Frost. Hannibal King sought out Damon Hellstrom, the son of Satan, to help resurrect Blade, believing there was a way to restore the vampire hunter's soul. Together, they exhumed Blade's grave and removed the stake from the chest of the dead doppelganger buried in his place. As soon as the stake was pulled free, the vampiric duplicate revived, but Hellstrom transformed into his demonic form and cast a powerful spell to separate Blade's spirit from the imposter's body. Once Blade was restored to life, Hannibal swiftly restaked the doppelganger, destroying it for good. With Blade reborn and whole again, both men thanked Hellstrom for his help. Elsewhere, Dracula bid goodnight to his pregnant wife Domini before going out to hunt. Spotting a woman with her child, he briefly considered feeding on her but hesitated, sparing her life and instead draining a lone passerby to satisfy his hunger. Meanwhile, Blade reunited with his lover Saffron for a brief emotional moment before rejoining Hannibal King. Together, they set out to confront their shared enemy, Deacon Frost, once and for all. At Frost's lair, Hannibal revealed what he had discovered about Frost's past. In 1868, Frost had been a brilliant German chemist who created a serum derived from a dead vampire's blood. When he used it on a corpse named Ilsa, her enraged husband attacked him, and in the struggle, Frost accidentally injected himself with his own serum, turning himself into a vampire. Unlike others, Frost gained unique powers, including the ability to create living doppelgangers of anyone he desired. As Blade and Hannibal finished discussing Frost's history, the vampire himself appeared, flanked by an army of duplicates of both Blade and Hannibal. Despite being outnumbered, the pair fought furiously and annihilated every copy. Frost retreated deeper into his laboratory, threatening to unleash a deadly fungus. Blade hurled 2 wooden daggers that struck Frost, sending him crashing into his machinery. The resulting explosion obliterated Frost's body and his lair. After barely escaping, Blade and Hannibal regrouped with their allies. With their vengeance fulfilled, the 2 men parted on good terms, Hannibal boarding a bus to begin a new life. Chapter 54, 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. On Christmas Eve, Domini, Dracula's bride, was nearing the birth of their child. She asked to be taken to the church they had claimed as their sanctuary. Dracula hesitated, uneasy about the oil painting of Christ that still hung there, a relic he could not remove. Domini insisted that since the mystical ritual that conceived their child had taken place in that church, his birth must happen there as well. Reluctantly, Dracula agreed and ordered Anton Lupesky to help transport her. At a nearby hospital, Quincy Harker recovered from another heart attack, while the vampire hunters, Rachel Van Helsing, Frank Drake, Blade, and Harold H. Harold discussed their next move. Reports suggested that Dracula's wife was about to bear his child, and they agreed he must be destroyed. Secretly, Rachel slipped away, pretending to gather supplies, but actually setting out to face Dracula alone. Rachel intercepted Lupesky, who feigned resistance before deliberately revealing Dracula's location, hoping she would destroy him. She called her team with the address, but entered the church by herself. There, she confronted Dracula and was swiftly overpowered and knocked unconscious. Dracula, unaware of Lupesky's true motives, ordered him to tie her up before assisting Domini. Lupesky left her bound near her crossbow, allowing Rachel to free herself and fire a signal flare. Frank, Blade, and Harold arrived moments later and helped her escape. Inside the church, Domini went into labor. As her cries echoed through the dark hall, the vampire hunters burst in. Dracula fiercely defended his wife, overpowering his foes until the sound of a newborn's cry filled the air. The child, gold-skinned, red-eyed, and sharp-eared, was born, halting the battle. Domini commanded peace and urged both sides to stop fighting. Dracula surprisingly obeyed, allowing the hunters to leave unharmed. As he and Domini departed with their child, Rachel confessed to her companions that she couldn't bring herself to kill Dracula. Chapter 55, Requiem for a Vampire. A fierce winter storm swept across Boston as Dracula prepared to address his congregation in the Church of the Damned. Before his speech, Domini called him to their chamber to look upon their newborn son. Dracula studied the child's golden skin and blood-red eyes, momentarily suspecting a link to the radiant being who once fought him, but dismissed the thought. Anton Lupesky soon arrived to discuss arrangements for the upcoming address. Dracula informed him that he no longer served the church's original satanic goals. He now intended to use the cult to achieve his own vision of global domination. Lupesky appeared obedient but secretly vowed to destroy Dracula and reclaim control. Elsewhere, Frank Drake, Rachel Van Helsing, and Aurora visited Quincy Harker, still recovering from his heart attack. The group reflected on their last confrontation with Dracula, recalling how some unknown force had stopped them from killing him. They discussed their next move, frustrated that they could not legally strike against the church since it remained under Lupesky's ownership. Back at the Church of the Damned, Lupesky introduced the congregation to Dracula and Domini's infant son, naming him Janus in honor of the new year and their supposed new order. Attempting to sway the followers' loyalty, Lupesky downplayed Dracula's authority, but the vampire lord quickly seized control of the gathering, reasserting his dominance before the entire congregation. Humiliated, Lupesky seethed with hatred and vowed to see Dracula destroyed. Among the audience, Harold H. Harold, sent by Rachel and Frank to spy, quietly slipped away to report the growing tension between Dracula and Lupesky. That evening, Dracula shared a quiet moment with Domini and Janus, confessing his struggle to truly love them. Domini revealed her past as Lupesky's submissive follower and how Dracula had given her life purpose again. They embraced before Dracula departed to feed. Meanwhile, Lupesky prepared silver bullets to kill Dracula, unaware that one of Dracula's loyal vampires was spying on him. When the vampire reported the betrayal, only Domini was home. Taking Janice in her arms, she confronted Lupesky herself. As Dracula wandered the night reflecting on his feud with Lupesky and his battle with the Golden Angel, he realized that, for the first time in centuries, he felt a sense of peace with his wife and child. Chapter 56. The Vampire Conspiracy. Harold H. Harold sat at his typewriter, working feverishly on what he believed would be his literary masterpiece, The Vampire Conspiracy. Though fictional, his story was filled with thinly veiled versions of people he knew personally, including himself as the heroic lead. In Harold's novel, he cast himself as the fearless leader of the Harold Supernatural Slayers, joined by Frank Drake and Rachel Van Helsing. The trio was summoned by Aurora Rabinowitz, who had recently inherited a foreboding estate known as Hellion House. Aurora confided in Harold about eerie phenomena plaguing the mansion, ghostly suits of armor that moved on their own and mysterious noises echoing through the halls. Delving into his research, Harold revealed the mansion's sinister 2-century history, warning that it had long been a magnet for supernatural evil. Inside the cursed home, the story took a darker turn. Satan himself appeared, taking the form of a massive black cat. The infernal being commanded his servant Dracula to destroy the intruders. Dracula struck first, ambushing Rachel Van Helsing and turning her into a vampire. Faced with no other choice, Frank was forced to slay Rachel to save her soul. Meanwhile, Harold portrayed himself as an expert martial artist who fearlessly battled both Dracula and Satan. In a dramatic showdown, he hurled Dracula backward onto a sharpened stake, impaling and destroying the vampire lord. With Dracula vanquished, the group torched Hellion House, watching it burn to ashes. In the finale, Harold's alter ego embraced Aurora in triumph, both survivors bathed in the glow of victory. Satisfied with his manuscript, Harold removed the final page, admired his work, and dropped it into the mailbox for submission. Moments later, the real Aurora arrived. Mustering his courage, Harold asked her out on a date. She politely declined, explaining she already had plans. As her car drove away, Harold sighed and muttered to himself, as they always say, the nice guys really do finish last. Chapter 57. The Forever Man. In 1792 India, a man named Gideon Smith, marked by a crescent birthmark on his face, met an Indian mystic who revealed his fate. He would live forever, endlessly reincarnated after every death, and only Dracula could end his curse. The mystic warned him never to cross paths with the vampire. Gideon dismissed this as superstition until days later, during a poker game aboard a ship, he was shot dead and immediately reborn as an Irish child named Patrick J. O'Reilly. Over the centuries, Gideon lived and died repeatedly. Patrick in 1820, Franklin X. Pomeroy's in 1860, Roger Perry Van Dunman, then Clark Jackson, who perished in World War II. Each death led to another rebirth until he once more became Gideon Smith in modern-day Boston, now a successful insurance salesman. One night, as he greeted his wife, Gideon saw Dracula and Domini walking outside, and a vague memory of the mystic's warning returned before his wife distracted him with talk of visiting her sister. Meanwhile, Domini confronted Anton Lupesky, the satanic priest plotting to kill Dracula. Lupesky manipulated her into silence by threatening to fabricate evidence, framing her as part of the murder plot, then ordered his followers to detain her and begin preparations for a celebration honoring Dracula and their son, Janus. That same night, Dracula hunted for prey while Gideon and his wife visited her sister. At a nearby street, police officers stumbled upon Dracula feeding on a victim. When one fled into a tenement, Dracula demanded entry. The officer invited him in, sealing his doom. During the struggle, the officer burned Dracula's face with a crucifix before dying. Dracula escaped but collapsed in the snow, found and rescued by a nun. Dracula awoke in a hospital room shared with none other than Gideon Smith. When the bandages came off, Gideon recognized him as the man foretold by the mystic and panicked. Dracula killed the attending doctors, boasting of his power, but fled when nurses entered. In the hall, he encountered Quincy Harker, Rachel Van Helsing, and Frank Drake, who attacked immediately. Dracula retreated, blaming Gideon and nearly killing him before the nun's crucifix drove him off. Flying into the night, Dracula returned to his family, while doctors later found Gideon white-haired and catatonic, frozen by terror after finally meeting the death he could not escape. Chapter 58, Undead by Daylight. Blight sat with his girlfriend Saffron, burdened by uncertainty. With Deacon Frost, the vampire who murdered his mother, finally dead, Blight confessed that he no longer knew his purpose. Hunting vampires was all he had ever known. Before Saffron could reveal something important, a strange new case was unfolding across Boston. At Boston General Hospital, a man named Musenda brought in his wife Lorraine, suffering from a bizarre curse. She was human by night but transformed into a vampire during the day. The baffled doctor called for expert help, summoning Rachel Van Helsing. During their meeting, Musenda revealed he once hunted vampires alongside Blade. Recognizing the name, Rachel told him Blade was in town and gave him the address. Reunited, Blade and Musenda returned to the hospital only to find chaos. Lorraine had escaped and killed the doctor. Blade fought for her, but when the moon rose, she reverted to her normal form and collapsed. Rachel theorized that Lorraine was psychically linked to a vampire. When that vampire rested, Lorraine became active as its daytime vessel. The only way to save her, Rachel said, was to destroy the vampire controlling her. Using a bat tracking device developed by Quincy Harker, Blade and Musenda planned to follow Lorraine once she transformed again. Near dawn, they allowed her to roam freely. As she turned into a bat, they followed her on motorcycles using Harker's tracker. The pursuit ended abruptly when a car forced them off the road into the water. Later, back at Blade's apartment, Blade guessed that Lorraine might have flown to the nearby lighthouse. They swam to the site where Blade was ambushed by Lorraine and accidentally staked her, killing her temporarily. Knowing a vampire revives when the stake is removed, they brought her to Saffron's home and revived her before sunset. Moments later, the true vampire behind Lorraine's curse arrived, vowing revenge and threatening to turn Saffron into a vampire. Enraged, Blade drove his wooden dagger through the creature's heart, reducing it to dust. With the vampire's death, Lorraine was freed from her curse and returned to normal, unaware of what had happened. Chapter 59, The Last Traitor. Anton Lupesky arrived unannounced at Quincy Harker's apartment, seeking help to kill Dracula. He presented the vampire hunters, Quincy, Frank Drake, Rachel Van Helsing, and Harold H. Harold, with guns loaded with silver bullets. Lupesky explained that Dracula was holding a celebration feast for his newborn son, Janus, and it was the perfect opportunity to strike. The hunters hesitated, knowing Lupesky's motives were rooted in his own ambitions rather than justice. But the memory of all those Dracula had murdered hardened their resolve, and they reluctantly agreed to join his plan. Meanwhile, Dracula spent the evening with his wife Domini and their infant son. Holding Janus in his arms, he felt a rare tenderness before leaving to hunt. In Boston, he came across a student named Barry attempting to seduce his teacher, Emily Arthurs. Dracula frightened Barry off, then turned on Emily, feeding on her. When he was finished, he hypnotically instructed Emily that when Barry returned, she was to submit to him, and afterward bite him, passing on the curse of vampirism. At Lupesky's mansion, the dinner celebration for Janus began, and as the guests arrived, the vampire hunters waited outside, ready to strike. When Dracula entered and Lupesky began his toast, Frank Drake and the others burst in. Taken by surprise, Dracula staggered back as Lupesky fired the first shot, wounding him. The vampire hunters opened fire with their silver bullets while Domini, clutching Janus, pleaded for them to stop. Despite his injuries, Dracula retaliated fiercely, hurling his attackers aside. When Rachel aimed for his heart, Dracula turned to mist and evaded the shot. Lupesky fired again, claiming the next bullet would pierce Dracula's heart, but as Dracula vanished into mist, the shot struck Janus instead. The room fell silent as Domini screamed. Enraged, Dracula crushed Lupesky's skull with his bare hands. As Domini mourned their child, she gazed at the glowing painting of Jesus and asked why such bloodshed was necessary. When Dracula vowed further vengeance, Domini stopped him, saying these events were destined. After the hunters departed, Dracula demanded to know why she obeyed the painting's words. Domini only declared her love and urged him to accept its message. Horrified, Dracula fled into the night in bat form. Chapter 60, The Wrath of Dracula. Dracula was consumed with fury after the death of his son, Janus, slayed by Anton Lupesky's betrayal. Domini tried to console him, but her words could not pierce his rage. Dracula ranted about those who sought to destroy him and turned his wrath toward the ever-watchful oil painting of Jesus Christ. He tried to destroy it, yet its divine power held him back. Looking upon the throne he had built for himself, Dracula saw it not as a monument of power, but as a mockery of his existence, and shattered it in frustration. As his fury waned, his thoughts drifted through centuries of memory. He recalled his life before the curse, when he was Vlad Dracula, forced into marriage with Zofia, a woman he neither loved nor respected. His cruelty toward her culminated in the murder of a chambermaid who refused his advances, an act that haunted him still. His memories then brought him to his daughter, Lilith, who appeared before him as a vision, taunting him for driving her mother to suicide so he could marry again. Dracula remembered his more recent encounter with Lilith in Paris, where she constantly thwarted his hunts by killing his victims before he could feed. Their feud continued until he lured her to England and impaled her near Big Ben, silencing her vengeance temporarily. Now, standing under a storm he conjured, Dracula pondered ending his own unlife. He reflected on his centuries of loss, his slain wives, his cursed children, and his isolation. He recalled giving his firstborn to gypsies, only for the boy to grow up to hunt him. As he fed that night, he mistook a frightened boy for Janus, and nearly broke down in grief. Looking to the heavens, Dracula demanded an end, but the storm cleared in silence. Taking this as divine mockery, he vowed vengeance upon the higher powers. Regaining his resolve, Dracula remembered Domini still lived, and with her he was not alone. As he took flight into the night, Domini knelt at Janus's grave, praying for his resurrection. She begged that when her son returned, he spare his father, and not force her to choose between them. Chapter 61. Resurrection. Dracula wandered the night, uncertain if he should return to his wife, Domini. Tormented by guilt, he wondered if leaving her was an act of mercy after all the grief he had caused. Still unable to decide, he transformed into a bat and soared through the dark skies to think in solitude. Elsewhere, in Quincy Harker's rented apartment, the vampire hunters debated their failure to destroy Dracula. Frank Drake, frustrated, cursed their missed opportunity. Quincy reasoned that with Dracula's son Janus dead, and the vampire having abandoned his cult, he would likely retreat from public view. Seeing this as their best chance, Quincy urged the group to strike now while Dracula was weakened and in mourning. Meanwhile, Dracula returned home only to find Domini gone. She had ventured to the graveyard, determined to resurrect their son. At Janus's tomb, she began casting a powerful spell to restore his life. Mystical forces raged against her, yet she pressed on, unearthing the coffin as a blinding bolt of energy shot from the heavens. Realizing her intent, Dracula rushed to stop her, fearing that reviving Janus would pervert their child's soul. At that same time, Harold H. Harold, still guilt-ridden over his role in Janus's death, visited Aurora Rabinowitz to bid farewell before leaving Boston. Unsure whether to go to Hollywood, where a film of his book The Vampire Conspiracy was being made, or to England to escape the chaos, Harold accepted Aurora's offer for one last dinner together. Back at the graveyard, Domini called upon the spirit of the Golden One, the radiant being once opposed to Dracula, to return and inhabit her son's body. As the golden light descended, Dracula arrived too late. Struck back by a divine bolt, he watched helplessly as the union completed. The resurrected Janus appeared, now an adult resembling the Golden One. When Domini asked him to love his father, Janus replied that though Dracula was his sire, he was destined to be his destroyer. Dracula screamed in anguish as his son's prophecy echoed through the storm. Chapter 62. What lurks beneath Satan's hill? Domini prayed in anguish, questioning why God had forced her to choose between her husband Dracula and their resurrected son Janus. When Janus appeared before her, she pleaded with him not to kill his father. Janus, however, remained resolute, believing Dracula must be punished for centuries of sin. To make her understand, he tried to reveal the horror of Dracula's deeds, but Domini struck him, tearfully reaffirming her love for her husband. Janus admitted he loved his father as well, but said his divine mission outweighed that love. Transforming into a radiant golden eagle, he soared into the night to confront Dracula. Janus found Dracula feeding on a young woman and struck him down with blazing energy bolts from his eyes. Using his power, he restored the victim's soul before she could rise as a vampire. Their ensuing battle raged across Boston, shifting between sky and ground, between their monstrous and human forms. Dracula found himself outmatched by Janus's divine might, forced to retreat through the city. Meanwhile, a mysterious tentacled creature prowled Boston's streets, abducting women and leaving them dead and completely hairless. Paramedics later found their corpses, baffled by their strange condition. As Domini reflected on the bitter parallel between Janus and Dracula's conflict and her own strained relationship with her father, the killings continue to spread fear through the city. During his flight from Janus, Dracula came across an ambulance carrying the mutilated victims. Sensing something unnatural, he attacked the vehicle to feed, only to discover the women's eerie state. When the terrified drivers offered no explanation, Dracula vowed to investigate further. Moments later, the corpses stirred back to life and vanished into the night, leaving the horrified drivers unconscious. Tracking the strange women, Dracula followed them to a mansion atop Satan's Hill. Inside, he found it decorated in Roman style and filled with an unsettling stillness. A scream from upstairs led him to Topaz, a woman he had once known in Transylvania, who revealed that she had summoned him to confront the evil lurking beneath Satan's Hill. Elsewhere, Frank Drake, walking with Rachel Van Helsing, suddenly fell under a trance and wandered off, unresponsive to her cries. Outside the mansion, Janus circled above, tracking his father's trail, while the monstrous tentacled creature that had slain the women crawled closer through the darkness. Chapter 63. The Road to Hell. Dracula arrived at the mansion on Satan's Hill and found Topaz waiting for him. She explained that after parting ways with Jack Russell, she had come to Boston and had been attacked by a monstrous creature haunting the area. Using her magic, she managed to fight it off, but awoke dressed in Roman garments within the mansion, which she revealed to Dracula was actually a gateway to hell. Elsewhere, Frank Drake, under a supernatural trance, raced toward the mansion, unaware that Rachel Van Helsing followed close behind. In the skies above, Janus trailed Dracula to the same place. As Rachel tried to enter the mansion with Frank, a violent wind sealed her out, locking Frank inside. Inside, he snapped out of his trance and came face to face with Janus. When Dracula and Topaz descended the stairs, Dracula's disgust deepened at finding both his son and ancestor gathered there. A disembodied voice filled the room, declaring that the entire Dracula bloodline, except Lilith, had been summoned because Dracula had invoked Satan's name in vain too many times. Each had been brought for judgment: Janus the angel-born, Frank the unworthy descendant, and Topaz a potential threat. Instantly, they were transported to a hellish arena where a demonic tentacled monster commanded Dracula and Janus to fight to the death, threatening Topaz's life to ensure obedience. Refusing to kill each other, father and son united against the demon, but it overpowered them with hellfire. Realizing Satan himself demanded the combat, they reluctantly fought. Janus seemingly killed Dracula, shocking the watching demons. But when the demon tried to contact its master, Janus unleashed divine power, annihilating them all, revealing Dracula's death had been a ruse. Outside, Rachel struggled with the sealed mansion door until Domini appeared, allowing her inside. Within the infernal realm, Dracula destroyed the demon with a stake, collapsing its domain. As the survivors escaped the burning mansion, Dracula and Topaz vanished, transported into hell itself. Descending into the Dark Lord's chamber, they were met by Satan, who decreed Dracula's time was over and that he would spend eternity in damnation. Chapter 64. Life after undeath. Dracula and Topaz found themselves transported into hell, standing before Satan himself. The Dark Lord seethed with fury at Dracula for invoking his name in vain too many times, and declared that the vampire's eternal existence must now end. Reveling in his own grand design, Satan explained that every being who bore his name existed to provide humanity with temptation and moral struggle. He revealed that Topaz's mystical abilities posed a danger to him in the future, and that Dracula, through his past defiance, had already set in motion events that could one day lead to Satan's downfall. For this reason, both were sentenced to destruction. Dracula defiantly refused to submit, but Satan struck him down with immense power. When Topaz asked what had been done to him, Satan cryptically replied that she would discover the truth soon enough. Meanwhile, on Earth, Frank Drake and Rachel Van Helsing brought Domini to Quincy Harker's home to discuss their next move against Dracula. Domini calmly informed them that their mission was meaningless now, that Dracula was gone forever. She urged them to abandon hate and learn love instead. Her words unsettled them, especially Rachel, who realized how long it had been since she had truly felt love. Elsewhere in Boston, a wealthy man whose daughter had been killed by Dracula hired a rugged bounty hunter, Francis Leroy Cowboy Brown, to track and destroy the vampire once and for all. Back in hell, Satan revealed that Dracula was not dead but transformed. Preparing to destroy Topaz next, he was suddenly confronted by her awakening powers. Topaz's magic surged uncontrollably, creating a violent clash with Satan that tore open the infernal realm. In the chaos, the force binding Dracula to hell was broken. Moments later, Dracula reappeared in Boston. When Rachel spotted him and attacked, the vampire turned to face her, and to her astonishment, she saw that Dracula had been transformed into a mortal man once more. Chapter 65, where no vampire has gone before. Rachel Van Helsing was stunned to discover that Dracula had been transformed back into a mortal man. Confronted with his humanity, she found herself unable to kill him and returned to Quincy Harker's apartment, where she informed Frank Drake, Janice, and Quincy of what had happened. The group debated whether they should still pursue and destroy Dracula for his centuries of atrocities now that he was no longer a vampire. Meanwhile, bounty hunter Francis Cowboy Brown interrogated and tortured a vampire to learn who had murdered his employer's daughter. The dying creature revealed that Dracula was responsible and currently in Boston. After killing the vampire, Cowboy set out to claim his bounty. In Boston, Dracula wandered the streets, struggling to adjust to life as a human. He encountered a drug-addicted prostitute named Harriet, who mistook him for a client and invited him to her apartment. Dracula's old habits surfaced. He asked to be invited in and recoiled at the sight of a crucifix. When Harriet offered him heroin, he refused, but their tense meeting was interrupted by a thug named Gunther, who arrived to reclaim money Harriet had stolen from his boss, Wild Jack. Dracula intervened and was shot in the arm, realizing in shock that he could bleed and feel pain again. Fighting back, he hurled Gunther out the window, drawing the attention of the police. Arrested and taken into custody, Dracula panicked at dawn, but was stunned to find that sunlight no longer harmed him. Harriet's statement cleared him of any charges and he was released. When a photographer tried to take his picture for a local story, Dracula attacked him in rage, prompting police pursuit and a citywide APB. Desperate and humiliated, Dracula resolved to reclaim his vampiric power, and decided that only his daughter Lilith was worthy to turn him again. Hungry and destitute, he nearly attacked a driver after a car narrowly missed him, but an angry mob chased him off. The incident made headlines, catching the attention of the vampire hunters. At the same time, Cowboy Brown overheard police reports of a hijacked plane heading to New York. Dracula's doing. Smiling grimly, the bounty hunter reloaded his gun and prepared to follow his prey to New York. Chapter 66, Showdown in Greenwich Village. Dracula arrived in New York City searching for his daughter Lilith, hoping she could restore his lost vampiric nature after Satan stripped it away. Hungry and penniless, he resorted to mugging a couple for food money. Disgusted by his own desperation, Dracula cursed Satan for condemning him to human weakness. When the woman's screams drew a crowd, he fled and hid inside a church. The priest offered him shelter, but Dracula's pride refused to accept help, and he stormed back into the night. He wandered into a disco bar and used the stolen money to buy a meal. There he met Anne Keats, a recently divorced woman who took a liking to him and invited him home. Along the way, she shared her story, and when she asked about his purpose in New York, Dracula told her he was searching for his daughter. Hoping to help, Anne brought him to an office that assisted runaways. But when the clerk asked for details, Dracula's arrogance flared. He refused help and stormed out again. Anne followed, and both were attacked by muggers. Despite being wounded, Dracula fought them off with superhuman ferocity. When Anne asked how he managed it, he revealed his true name. As police sirens approached, Anne took him back to her apartment, unaware that bounty hunter Cowboy Brown was trailing them. At her home, Dracula recounted his life story, which Anne found difficult to believe. He asked her to use her phone to call his wife, Domini, informing her of his search for Lilith. Though saddened, Domini accepted his decision. Moments later, the cowboy burst in, shooting Dracula in the arm. A brutal fight followed, ending on the rooftop where Dracula hurled the bounty hunter to his death before collapsing from blood loss. As Anne called for help, Dracula survived. His attack made newspaper headlines that soon reached Lilith, who took a keen interest in her father's fate. Chapter 67, At Long Last, Lilith. Dracula continued his search for his daughter Lilith in New York City and found himself strangely drawn to a pregnant woman named Angel O'Hara, unaware that Angel was acting as Lilith's mortal host. Following Angel home, Dracula burst into her apartment and threatened her partner, Martin Gold, warning him not to interfere. Entering the bathroom, he found Angel showering, only for Lilith to emerge, taking control of her host and transforming into her vampiric form. Lilith mocked Dracula, saying she knew he had come to beg her to restore his vampire powers, which had been stripped by Satan. Refusing to help, she reminded him that she still hated him for causing her mother's death centuries ago. Lilith transformed into a bat and viciously attacked her father, driving him from the apartment. Humiliated, Dracula swore vengeance. Lilith led Dracula to a stage production called Passion of Dracula, an adaptation of Bram Stoker's story. Outraged that mortals were profiting from his legend, Dracula stormed the theater, unaware that Harold H. Harold was in the audience with an aspiring actress named Darlene, whom he had lured with false promises of a film role. Meanwhile, in Boston, Janus returned to Domini, who asked again if he intended to kill his father. Janus admitted that though the time was not yet right, his destiny demanded it. Back in New York, Lilith crashed into the theater mid-performance, with Dracula pursuing her. Their violent confrontation sent the terrified audience fleeing. Lilith summoned hordes of rats to attack Dracula, but Harold tried to help and was quickly knocked aside. The battle spilled into the streets as Lilith conjured a storm and unleashed stray dogs and hypnotized humans upon her father. As Harold called Quincy Harker and his vampire hunters for aid, Dracula barely escaped, forced to flee when police arrived. Mocking him, Lilith vanished into the night. Bruised and beaten, Dracula sought refuge in an alleyway, where a homeless man took pity on his battered state. Reflecting on his failure with Lilith, Dracula decided his only hope now lay with his son, Janus. Chapter 68, The Return to Transylvania. Desperate to regain the vampiric powers that Satan stripped from him, Dracula climbed to the top of the Empire State Building and defiantly shouted his survival to the heavens. His son Janus appeared, and Dracula demanded his help in restoring his undead form. Janus initially refused, but when the higher powers commanding him intervened, he reluctantly obeyed. Using his celestial power, Janus transported Dracula back to Transylvania, the one place where he might reclaim his vampiric heritage. However, Dracula quickly discovered that Janus had led him into a trap. Quincy Harker and the vampire hunters were waiting for him. As they attacked, Dracula pleaded for his son's aid, but Janus vanished, leaving him behind. The hunters pressed their assault, but when Frank Drake moved too close, Rachel Van Helsing hesitated to fire a killing shot with her crossbow. Dracula fought off Saint and escaped through a secret passage. When the hunters regrouped, Janus met with a mysterious man who would soon play a major role in Dracula's downfall. Meanwhile, Dracula discovered the coffin of a vampire named Marissa and demanded she turn him back into one of the undead. Marissa refused, declaring allegiance to her new master, a vampire lord named Torgo. She struck Dracula and fled in bat form. Marissa's flight drew the hunters to Dracula's location, and the fight resumed. During the brutal struggle, Dracula nearly strangled Rachel before Frank intervened. Outside, Dracula and Frank fiercely battled until Frank accidentally impaled himself with his own arrow, allowing Dracula to flee into a nearby cemetery. There he was ambushed and beaten by Torgo's vampire legion, but left alive. Weakened, Dracula encountered what appeared to be Quincy Harker and begged for divine aid, renouncing Satan. Quincy laughed, then revealed himself to be Satan in disguise. Satan mocked him, saying his humiliation fulfilled the sin of pride, before vanishing. At that moment, Dracula's vampiric powers were restored. The real Quincy arrived soon after, witnessing the aftermath. Though Dracula had regained his powers, Quincy declared that the vampire lord had been broken and allowed him to wander away into the night. Chapter 69, Batwings over Transylvania. Broken and weakened, yet restored to his vampire state, Dracula fled across the dark Transylvanian countryside, pursued by his former minions who now sought his death. Swarmed by an army of vampires, he transformed into a bat and escaped toward a nearby village. The terrified townsfolk, aware of the creatures prowling outside, barricaded themselves indoors for the night. In a nearby home, the widowed Maria Taraka tended to her sick daughter, Tessa. Realizing the girl needed urgent medical care, Maria armed her other children with crucifixes for protection and ventured into the night by horse-drawn carriage. Along the road, she encountered Dracula, who, driven by hunger and weakness, tried to feed on her. Maria fought him off with her crucifix, forcing the vampire lord to retreat. Desperate and hunted, Dracula reached Maria's home and begged the children to let him in. Though the sight of their crosses burned him, he stayed inside, realizing it was his only refuge against the army outside. Soon the surrounding vampires gathered at the house, their wings flapping and shrieking as they demanded Dracula come out. Meanwhile, Quincy Harker and his vampire hunters came across Maria and Teresa on the road, rescuing them and taking them to the hospital. Back at the Taraka home, the relentless vampires broke windows and battered the doors, but could not enter without invitation. To flush out their prey, they sent swarms of rats into the house. Despite his pain from the holy symbols, Dracula fought beside the terrified children. He urged them to have faith in Christ, so that their crosses would repel the creatures. In agony, he seized a crucifix from the wall and wielded it himself, driving the vampire horde away. When the danger passed, Dracula vanished into the night. Later, Quincy and the hunters brought Maria home, discovering the house in shambles but the children unharmed. They told of a mysterious good man who had taught them how to fight off the monsters. Chapter 70, Lords of the Undead. Dracula pursued his former legion of vampires to the cemetery where they had taken refuge, wielding a cross in defiance. His former followers mocked him for lowering himself to use the symbol of their mortal enemies. Realizing the humiliation, Dracula cast the crucifix aside and demanded to be taken to their new master, Torgo, the vampire who had claimed leadership after Dracula's fall and restoration. The vampires obeyed, unaware that Dracula's son Janus was secretly following them. When brought before Torgo, Dracula was shocked to find that the new lord commanded the loyalty of every vampire and could even compel Dracula's obedience. Meanwhile, Quincy Harker and his vampire hunters prepared for what they hoped would be their final confrontation with the vampire lord. Seeking to reclaim his throne, Dracula challenged Torgo to single combat to decide who would rule all vampires. Torgo accepted and revealed his origin. Centuries earlier, he had been left for dead after a battle with Attila the Hun, only to be bitten and turned by Leanda, the same gypsy vampire who had transformed Dracula himself. Armed with wooden stakes, the two clashed in a brutal, decisive battle. Though Torgo initially overpowered him, Dracula's ferocity proved unmatched. He drove his stake into Torgo's heart, killing him instantly and reclaiming his title as Lord of the Vampires. Dracula returned to Castle Dracula, exhausted from the fight, only to find Quincy Harker waiting. Setting his wheelchair to self-destruct, Quincy impaled Dracula through the heart with a broken spoke. Racing against the ticking bomb, he tried to decapitate Dracula and filled his head with garlic, but failed before the explosion consumed them both. Frank, Rachel, and Harold arrived soon after to find the ruins of the castle and Quincy's shattered chair. Later, Rachel read a farewell letter Quincy had written, revealing he was dying and had sought a final confrontation with Dracula. The letter urged Rachel to embrace life with Frank and find peace. In Boston, Dominique gazed at the stars as Janus appeared to tell her Dracula was dead. Holding her son, she watched as the golden angelic spirit departed his body, leaving Janus as a human child once more. Dracula was dead at last and had left a legacy in Janus. And so, my long readers, the great Count Dracula lies dead at last, his fangs dulled, his empire of blood reduced to dust. But death is never the end for creatures of the night, only another shadow waiting to rise. The grave is quiet now, yet the wind still whispers his name. Until the next hunt, keep your crucifixes close, your stakes sharp, and your veins unseen, because in the world of horror, no tomb stays sealed forever.